At the demonic Murim Alliance, also known as the Demon Palace, a long line of young martial artists stretched outside its gates. One of the guards sighed at the sight and muttered that there were far too many people gathered. The other guard beside him responded, reminding him that the Demon Palace had declared it would accept anyone regardless of faction or sect, as long as they had potential, and would even teach them demonic martial arts. He then sighed as well and remarked that no fool would miss such an opportunity. The first guard smirked and admitted that if he had been younger, he would have applied as well. Suddenly the second guard noticed a particular young figure among the crowd. With a puzzled expression, he asked aloud whether someone had died. His fellow guard frowned, pointing out that the 10 Demon Palace competition had not even begun yet, and asked if he was once again jumping to conclusions. The second guard insisted, ask who that young undertaker could be. The boy in question carried a wooden box on his back. He looked up toward the sky, his gaze firm, and muttered inwardly that this was only the beginning. He called upon his grandfather in his thoughts. His name was Bu Yun-sol, a name given to him by the man he loved dearly, after being found abandoned in a field of snow. He had been raised by his grandfather, who had also been an undertaker, and learned the same trade from him. He remembered one of the many days they had spent together, examining corpses as part of their work. On that occasion, Yun-sol had pointed out that the deceased before them must have been an expert in a swordsmanship style known for its swiftness. When his grandfather asked him what made him think so, Yun-sol had explained that although the man was skinny, the muscles of his left leg, especially in the front part of the calf, were exceptionally toned. This, he deduced, was a unique trait linked to that very style of swordsmanship. His grandfather had smiled warmly, patted his head, and praised him for his sharp eye, declaring that he was an undertaker gifted by the heavens. Life had been harsh, and people despised their kind, but with his grandfather beside him, everything had been bearable, until that one night. In the middle of the night, his grandfather had stirred from his sleep. The air outside was unnervingly calm, but then a sudden gust shook the bamboo trees. His sharpened senses detected something unusual. After gazing outside for some time, he lowered his head and sighed, murmuring that those who were kind never sought him out, and those who sought him out were never kind. He woke Yun-sol gently, shaking his shoulder and calling him Seal. As the boy sat up, still drowsy, his grandfather told him they would play a game of who could pretend to be dead better. Yun-sol asked why so late at night. His grandfather promised that if he performed well this time, he would buy him the clothes and sword he had wanted so badly. The boy's face lit up with excitement as he asked if that was true. His grandfather reassured him, then placed him inside a closet. Before closing the door, he instructed him to endure until sunrise this time. Yun-sol asked in confusion why on sunrise, but before he could protest, the door was closed. His grandfather then grabbed his sword and stepped out of the house with his sword at his side. No sooner had he closed the door behind him than a chilling voice greeted him from the darkness. The voice accused him of hiding himself away like a rat. Standing before him was a mysterious figure wearing a veil hat, radiating an ominous aura. The figure addressed him by his old name, the 7-branched demonic blade, Bu Jianyang. Yun-sol's grandfather smirked faintly and admitted that it had been a long time since he had heard that name. The figure drew his blade and shouted that Bu Jianyang had abandoned his position as vice palace master just to eke out a living with inferior work. He lunged forward in fury. Bu Jianyang blocked the attack easily with his bare hands and smirked, declaring that he had not become an undertaker merely to survive but to repent. The mysterious swordsman grinned at the response, only for Bu Jianyang to insist that he was willing to give up his life but wished to fight elsewhere, where no innocent people would be harmed. The man laughed loudly, mocking the request, but agreed, warning him not to think of running away. Inside the house, Yun-sol endured the game for as long as he could, but he eventually pushed open the closet door and exhaled deeply. Tears filled his eyes as he hugged his body to fend off the cold. He muttered that he could not endure any longer. He wanted the uniform and sword more than anything, but the cold was unbearable. When he realized his grandfather was not waiting for him, as he usually did when they played the game, he grew anxious. Perhaps the enforcers had summoned him again. He muttered bitterly that those people never even considered undertakers human. When he stepped outside, his eyes widened at the sight of sword marks carved all across the ground. He heard the faint clash of battle nearby, and instinct drove him to run toward it. When he arrived, his breath caught in his throat. Horror froze his expression as tears swelled in his eyes. His grandfather sat against a tree, blood covering his body, his eyes shut tight with blood streaming down from them. Yoon-sol screamed desperately and rushed to his side. He crouched beside him, stammering, unable to form coherent words. His grandfather, his voice faint, asked if it was him. Yoon-sol, crying heavily, assured him that it was. When he asked what had happened, his grandfather simply apologized and admitted it was his time to go. He told Yoon-sol that if he died, he should never continue the undertaker's trade. Blood spilled from his lips as he coughed. Yoon-sol, frantic, begged him to stop talking. But his grandfather insisted that he listen. He called him by his full name, Bu Yoon-sol, and urged him never to pursue revenge. Yoon-sol's rage boiled over. Tears and fury erupted from him as he screamed that he could never forgive those who had done this. He shouted that he could not accept it, then, with his voice breaking, added softly that he would rather follow his grandfather into death. His grandfather had always told him there was no difference between hell and this world, and he would rather be in hell with him than be left here with Aum. With his last shaky breath, his grandfather confessed that he thought he would have been able to let go easily when death came for him. But his final request was that Yoon-sol go far away. He told him that he had been so very happy during the time they had shared together. Then his head sank, and his body grew still. Yoon-sol froze, unable to move. His widened eyes poured tears as he called out to him again and again. Eventually, his sorrow consumed him. He looked down at his grandfather's lifeless body lying on a cooling board, and muttered his name softly. He reached out, touched his grandfather's face, and admitted that his request not to seek revenge had been meant to protect him. Yet, he whispered that he could not obey. With determination hardening his gaze through his tears, he examined the wounds. His grandfather's arms had been cut off at the same time. The strike began upward and then changing midway to stab his eyes. Such a technique was rare and belonged only to the demonic path. He identified it as the Tianju Yoga technique. On his back were 93 traces of hidden weapon usage, even more than the renowned Sky Full of Falling Flowers technique, which used only 66 at most. He concluded it must have been done with a device capable of unleashing hundreds at once. On top of that, the underside of his grandfather's tongue and the discoloration of his nails confirmed poisoning from the lethal toxin that caused putrid flesh and rotten blood. Yoon-sol determined with certainty that the killer was a practitioner of the demonic path who had mastered the Tianju Yoga technique, possessed a high-caliber hidden weapon device, and used lethal poisons. There could not be many such people. He swore in his heart that he would find them, no matter what. Back in the present, a tear fell onto the paper in front of him as he filled out his name on the registration form. The guards watching him whispered among themselves, one scoffing that he must have been from some backwater sect like the Janyang clan. He thought the boy had probably grown frightened after seeing the agreement papers that required them to surrender bodily autonomy. One of the guards leaned forward, telling him that if he was not going to stamp his finger, he should just leave. But before the guard could finish his words, Yoon-sol bit down hard on his lips until blood dripped. His face was calm yet burning with fury. Both guards stared in shock as he pressed his bloodied finger firmly against the paper, stamping his mark. Inside his mind, Yoon-sol declared his resolve. The moment his grandfather had died, his life had collapsed, leaving him nothing but the path of vengeance. He told himself that this competition would become his very first step toward revenge. The orthodox and unorthodox sects both revolved around the Demon Palace, a place that worshipped power above all else. For ages, the two forces that controlled the Murim had been locked in an endless struggle. Though they had maintained a fragile balance for a long time, the orthodox sects sought to push forward and claim supremacy. They became known as the so-called Masters for the greater good. And with the growing strength of the Murim alliance, the balance threatened to collapse. Faced with this looming threat, the Demon Palace devised a method to strengthen its own influence. They declared a plan to create the 10 Demon Masters, regardless of a candidate's past affiliations. They would select 10 prodigies and teach them the martial arts of the 10 demonic sects. The announcement stirred great ambition across the land. The chance to learn proper martial arts under the Demon Palace was an offer that many young men, consumed by dreams of power and desperation, could not ignore. They flocked to the palace, eager to seize the opportunity. Yoon-sol was among those who entered the annex of the Demon Palace. As soon as he stepped inside, He felt the cold and piercing gazes of other young martial artists. Their stares lingered on him for a long moment as he made his way deeper into the hall. He quietly observed the other candidates and studied the surroundings. Inwardly, he admitted to himself that he sensed formidable auras from quite a few of those present. Among them, he suspected, was someone connected to the killer of his grandfather. He thought about the murderer, recognizing that the person must be a martial master far beyond his current ability to judge. If he was to take revenge on such a figure, he too would have to rise to the level of a martial master. But as of now, he stood with no affiliation and no knowledge of martial arts. For him, the only way to grow stronger quickly was to become one of the 10 demon masters. The room suddenly fell silent as a figure appeared at the center. The candidates froze as a muscular old man stepped forward and shouted his name. He introduced himself as Hyuk Raeoneung, the head instructor. His commanding voice echoed through the hall, and whispers immediately spread among the young martial artists. They spoke in awe, recognizing him as the head instructor himself and referring to him with hushed reverence as the Gold Dagger Blood Eyes. Hyuk Raeoneung raised his voice again and declared that this place existed to identify the greatest prodigies among all demon sects. Only those who passed through every trial prepared by the palace would be chosen as candidates for the 10 demon masters. He announced that the first trial would begin immediately and that the martial artists of the Demon Palace would inspect the physical aptitude of each participant. Murmurs of dissatisfaction broke out. Several young martial artists protested loudly, questioning how such an inspection could even be considered a trial. Others demanded a competition instead, something that would allow them to demonstrate their strength directly. Despite the protests, the martial artists of the palace began that inspection without hesitation. They touched and examined each part of the candidates' bodies, judging their bones, muscles, and overall condition. Standing to the side, Yeonsol quietly muttered to himself that those who passed would move on to the next stage and that the test was entirely based on physical aptitude. As he observed, a palace martial artist began to approach him. Yeonsol, sensing the man's presence, thought inwardly that the examiner had arrived for him. The martial artist touched Yeonsol's body and was immediately taken aback. He was shocked and thought to himself that the young man before him was utterly unprepared, completely unsuited for such a competition, and must have made a grave mistake by even participating. Yet when he looked directly into Yeonsol's eyes, he recognized something undeniable. The killing intent radiating from the boy was unmistakably real. Even so, the inspector cleared his throat and walked away, deciding in his mind that he still could not allow Yeonsol to pass. Yeonsol had already expected such an outcome. He told himself inwardly that this result was inevitable. All he had ever learned was how to look after corpses, and there was no possible way he could succeed in a trial based solely on physical aptitude. Yet he also told himself that this could not be the end. Hyuk Raeoneung then shouted that the first trial had ended. The announcement stirred another round of protests. One of the young martial artists raised his voice and declared that the process was far too unfair. He argued that if physical aptitude alone determined the 10 demon masters, there was no reason to hold a competition at all. His words spread quickly, and frustration rippled through the candidates. The head instructor's gaze sharpened as he responded with a cold and cutting tone. He told the protester that in martial arts, muscles and bones were the most important foundations. The competition, he explained, was not meant to measure physical strength alone but to draw in those with ambition and attitude from various regions. He challenged the young man directly, asking how he could dare to complain when he could not even meet the most basic of their standards. The protester shouted back that they should at least be given a fair opportunity. At this, Hyuk Raeoneung's eyes narrowed further, and lightning chi erupted from his body, crackling in the air with terrifying intensity. He declared in a commanding tone that there was no need for concern. He promised that in the second trial, he would personally select those who could learn martial arts well, even if they had poor physical aptitude. He then announced that the second trial would begin immediately. His order rang out clearly. From that moment forward, the candidates were to fight each other and survive until only one remained alive. The announcement sent a wave of nervous chatter through the hall. The young martial artists recoiled at the command, unable to believe what they had heard. Some muttered in disbelief, asking if the palace was truly serious about making them kill each other. Others hesitated, pointing out that they were all meant to be on the same side. The original protester, however, saw the situation differently. He laughed bitterly and muttered to himself that the conditions suited him well. He told himself that no matter the trial, it would benefit him. If killing was required, then he would begin with the weakest. He sharpened his gaze, scanning the candidates for an easy target. His eyes eventually locked on a martial artist standing beside Yoon Sol. Without hesitation, he tightened his grip on his spear. His mind echoed with the decision that if he needed to kill someone, he would start with the one before him. In the next instant, he hurled his spear with all his strength. As the weapon cut through the air, he thought to himself that this man would be the first to die. Yeonsol's eyes widened in shock as he noticed the spear flying directly toward their direction. The spear struck its target with deadly precision. The attacker's face twisted into a wide grin as he shouted that this was his moment, his chance to kill. His voice rang out as he called the victim's name. "Red Dragon!" The young martial artist known as Red Dragon gritted his teeth, his body trembling as blood poured from his mouth. He clutched the spear that had pierced straight through him and muttered the name of his assailant with bitter recognition. His voice was faint and broken as he whispered, "Wee Wonchung." His strength then gave out, and he collapsed lifelessly to the ground. The other participants gasped in horror. One of them stammered that Wee Wonchung had actually killed him, while another clutched his mouth and said he was going to vomit at the sight of so much blood. Beside the fallen body, Yoon Sol stood motionless with a splatter of blood across his face. He stared coldly at the corpse and analyzed what he had just witnessed. Inwardly, he observed that Wee Wonchung had avoided the ribs by the narrowest margin and driven the spear straight into the heart. Though his frame was weak, the man possessed sharp reflexes and remarkable agility. Wee Wonchung yanked the bloodied spear from the corpse and raised it with pride, his grin widening as he declared loudly that anyone else who wanted to be skewered like Red Dragon should step forward. He shouted his name, proclaiming himself as Wee Wonchung, and promised to take care of any challenger. At the front, Hyuk Reonyeong watched the display from above. His expression was stern as he remarked that Wee Wonchung acted decisively but lacked the most basic sense of judgment. He muttered that the hall was filled with nothing but worthless fools. Behind him, one of the palace martial artists nodded and agreed. The man thought quietly to himself that in battles such as these, exposing oneself as a clear threat only ensured becoming the target of others. Still, he acknowledged that Wee Wonchung's reckless display would at least stir the rest into motion. Down in the annex, panic began to spread among the remaining candidates. One muttered in a trembling voice, asking what he should do, and fearing what would happen if things continued this way. Then, chaos erupted without restraint. A participant lashed out suddenly and cut down the man in front of him. His eyes widened in shock at what he had done, and he staggered back, dropping his weapon and groaning that he had stepped forward unknowingly. Before he could gather himself, another participant rushed in and drove a blade into his side, ending him instantly. Hyuk Reonyeong observed the frenzy with a cold, calculating gaze. Inwardly, he reflected that the younger ones who had never experienced death would find their senses paralyzed when faced with the prospect of their own end. His thoughts were interrupted when something in the crowd caught his eye. He narrowed his gaze and muttered in surprise. The martial artist standing behind him noticed as well, and silently thought to himself that not all of them were fools after all. What had drawn their attention was the sight of Yoon Sol and another youth. Both stood apart from the carnage, calm and collected, merely watching as the chaos unfolded in the center of the hall. Yoon Sol's gaze was cold as he studied the bloodshed before him. He thought to himself that the others were fools who had lost themselves entirely to fear. Hyuk Reonyeong's command had been simple: survive until only one remained. To Yoon Sol, that meant the trial was not about killing, but about enduring. He crouched beside one of the corpses and examined the wounds carefully, his mind sharp and detached. He told himself that he could guarantee his survival if he continued to think rationally and act without hesitation. Above all, he resolved that he would live, no matter what. One of the participants eventually noticed him on the sidelines and muttered in disdain. At a glance, he said, the boy looked pathetic, like someone who had been hiding in the shadows all this time. Yoon Sol ignored the remark and continued to study the body. His sharp eyes traced the thin yet persistent marks carved into the flesh. He deduced that the corpse had fallen to a swift flurry of swordplay, likely unleashed by someone wielding a slender blade. The participant who had singled him out decided to strike. With a menacing grin, he launched his chained weapon toward Yoon Sol and declared loudly that he would kill him himself. Yoon Sol barely tilted his head in time to dodge, but the weapon shattered the wooden box strapped to his back. The box split open, scattering its contents onto the ground. Among the debris, a cloth unfurled into the open. The attacker scoffed mockingly and pointed at Yoon-sul, jeering that he looked like nothing more than a peddler of temple relics. Yoon-sul knelt down and reached for the fallen items, his eyes falling upon them with quiet intensity. As he touched the cloth, memories resurfaced. He recalled the moment after his grandfather's death when he had discovered the box's contents: a cloth, a short sword, and a folded piece of paper. He remembered opening the paper and reading the words written upon it. The note had been simple yet heavy with meaning. "Happy birthday, grandfather." As the memory faded, Yoon-sul's eyes sharpened. He lifted his gaze to the participant who had attacked him. The assailant spun his weapon above his head and prepared to strike again. He taunted Yoon-sul, asking mockingly if he really intended to fight back. He scoffed at the short sword the boy held, ridiculing it as a puny weapon, and sneered as he asked what Yoon-sul thought he could possibly do with it. Before he could finish his assault, another figure appeared behind him in a flash. A blade cut through the air, and in an instant, the attacker was slain, his body falling limply to the ground. The strike had come from the same young martial artist who, like Yoon-sul, had been watching the chaos quietly earlier. The swordsman smirked as he looked at Yoon-sul. He told him not to bother with thanks, sneering that pathetic trash like him only distracted opponents and made things easier for someone stronger. Yoon-sul did not respond. He kept his back turned, still focused on retrieving the cloth his grandfather had left him. The young swordsman, however, was not finished. He remarked that Yoon-sul had sharp eyes, but it was clear he had never learned martial arts. His smirk deepened as another participant tried to ambush him from behind. Without even glancing back, he swung his sword and cut the man down in one swift motion. He declared coldly that someone like Yoon-sul could be killed at any time. Yoon-sul turned his head slightly toward him, his eyes narrowing. From above, Hawk Ryun-young's gaze fixed on the swordsman who had spoken to Yoon-sul. His eyes gleamed with recognition, and he muttered that the boy was wielding the extermination sword. He questioned aloud why such a youth would be carrying the legacy blade of Black Soul. The wanderer once hailed as the strongest swordsman of his era. The martial artist standing behind him provided the answer. He explained that the young man's name was Nuong Woongang. According to rumor, deep within a secluded valley, Woongang had discovered Black Soul's secret manual along with the legendary sword itself. He had trained solely from the manual, but his forms lacked refinement, and his movements were riddled with openings. Still, despite his shortcomings, he was recognized as the sole disciple of Black Soul. Though lacking in raw physical strength, he was regarded as one of the strongest candidates for the 10 Demon Masters. The man concluded that Woongang might very well be the one to emerge victorious. Hyuk Ryenin frowned and admitted that, in truth, Woongang was still nothing more than a greenhorn unworthy of holding the hilt of the extermination sword. Yet, at least in this place, it seemed there was no one stronger than him. The martial artist beside him agreed, though he added cautiously that unless something truly unexpected occurred, Woongang's victory was nearly certain. Meanwhile, Yoon-sul continued to study the corpses around him. His cold eyes scanned the cuts across one body, and he muttered that the sword marks were rough, indicating a lack of skill despite the swiftness of the strikes. The bloodshed eventually ended. One by one, the combatants fell until only 2 remained. Nuong Woongang stood with his blade dripping crimson, his breath calm as he wiped the blood from its edge. Across from him, Yoon-sul rose to his feet at last. Woongang looked at him with an amused expression and spoke aloud. He admitted that he had not expected Yoon-sul to be the one to survive until the end. With a sharp grin, he said that if he killed Yoon-sul now, he too would become a candidate for the 10 Demon Masters. He taunted him further, raising his sword and challenging him to come at him. Yoon-sul's gaze met his with unwavering focus. He stood in silence for a moment, staring at the strongest opponent present. Inwardly, his thoughts sharpened. He admitted to himself that Woongang was indeed the strongest among them. Yet he also knew something Woongang did not. Through his cold observations, he had already discovered his opponent's weakness. Yoon-sul gripped his short blade tightly and walked toward the middle of the annex, preparing himself for what was to come. Standing in front of him, Nuong Woongang fixed his gaze on him and asked with a smirk if he should test Yoon-sul's skills a little. Without hesitation, Nuong Woongang lunged forward, attacking with his weapon. Yoon-sul barely managed to evade, his movements clumsy and unrefined. Nuong Woongang laughed mockingly as he unleashed a barrage of strikes, shouting that dodging clumsily seemed to be all Yunsol was capable of. He taunted him further, claiming it was impressive he had lasted this long. From the side, one of the martial artists who stood beside Hyuk Ryeonyoung observed the fight carefully. At first glance, it looked as though Yunsol was helplessly being beaten down, but as the man narrowed his eyes, he noticed the truth. Yunsol twisted his body at the last moment of each strike, always avoiding a fatal blow. The observer clenched his fist tightly as realization struck him. Yunsol had memorized Nyung Woongong's attack patterns by examining the corpses left in his wake. It was an astonishing level of observation that bordered on genius. After enduring a flurry of attacks, Yunsol finally stopped to catch his breath. With sharp eyes, he muttered that Nyung Woongong's sword techniques were pathetic. Despite such a relentless barrage, all he had managed to do was slice Yunsol's flesh without inflicting a mortal wound. Nyung Woongong froze at his words, surprised at the audacity of the remark. The martial artist who was watching clenched his fist harder, realizing Yunsol was deliberately provoking his opponent. He knew Yunsol was evading skillfully, but landing a proper counterattack was an entirely different matter. With his frail body, a solid strike would be nearly impossible. Nyung Woongyang's grin widened at the provocation. He responded that he had originally planned to let Yunsol live a little longer, but since he wished to be arrogant, then perhaps he wanted to die quickly. He leapt forward with ferocity, screaming that he would grant Yunsol his wish. At the front, Yunsol braced himself for the decisive attack. His thoughts raced as he reminded himself that this chance would only come once. He recalled what he had discovered while examining the corpses of Nyung Woongyang's victims. Every finishing strike had been aimed directly at a vital point, most often the heart or the head. Whenever Nyung Woongyang was driven by murderous intent, his blade inevitably targeted the opponent's upper body. If that was always the case, then Yunsol had found his opening. As Nyung Woongyang swung his sword in a powerful horizontal arc, Yunsol ducked low, evading the blow. Nyung Woongyang's eyes widened slightly in surprise as he looked down at him. In that instant, Yunsol locked his gaze on his opponent, his short blade already aimed at his neck. He remembered the words of his grandfather, who had once told him that the Tiantu acupoint was difficult to train and toughen, even for a martial master. If a child struck it with full strength, even an adult could faint instantly. With sharp determination, Yunsol jolted upward, driving his short blade toward the vulnerable point. A spray of blood burst forth, splattering across the ground as the blade pierced Nyung Woongyang's neck. His body collapsed instantly, lifeless, crashing down at Yunsol's feet. Catching his breath and trembling from exhaustion, Yunsol stood as the only one remaining in the annex. In a faint, trembling voice, he whispered to himself, asking if it was finally over. At the side, the martial artist and Hyuk Ryeonyoung were both left in shock by the scene. The martial artist muttered in disbelief, calling it an unexpected variable. Hyuk Ryeonyoung admitted that he had some expectations since the sword art of Black Soul had been invoked. Yet this outcome had surpassed what he had anticipated. He raised his voice and shouted to the hall that Bu Yunsol had passed the second trial. Yunsol stood frozen in the middle of the annex, struggling to process the outcome. His mind drifted, and suddenly he found himself face to face with the image of his grandfather. His grandfather's voice echoed as he called out for him, asking where Yunsol was. The younger Yunsol, in his memory, called back cheerfully, waving from behind with a bright smile and shouting that he was there. His grandfather, however, continued to mutter his name in confusion, insisting that he could not see him. The boyish Yunsol, still smiling, approached with eagerness and asked what he meant. But then, his expression shattered in horror. His grandfather turned around, his figure grotesque and lifeless. His eyes were gone, replaced by bloody hollows that dripped crimson. In a chilling voice, his grandfather declared that he could not see Yunsol's figure at all. Yunsol jolted awake with a gasp, his body trembling. He realized he had been dreaming. As he looked around, he noticed he was no longer in the annex. Instead, he was in a confined space surrounded by other young martial artists who glared at him with cold, unwelcoming eyes. The sound of ocean waves echoed faintly, and the steady creak of a ship traversing the sea reached his ears. Clutching his head, he muttered to himself in confusion, realizing it looked like the inside of a ship. He wondered aloud if he had fainted, acknowledging that he had indeed lost a great deal of blood. Examining his own body, he was startled to find that his grave injuries no longer caused him much pain. He questioned whether a renowned physician, befitting the Demon Palace, had been summoned to treat him. As his gaze shifted to the other young martial artists, he noticed that their bodies were well-trained and disciplined. Some of their faces even appeared strangely familiar. He realized they must have been the ones who had passed the first trial. The others smirked at him with contempt, their expressions filled with derision. Yoon-sol sighed and muttered to himself that such contemptuous gazes were to be expected. At that moment, a martial artist of the Demon Palace suddenly opened a latch from above. His commanding voice rang out as he ordered the group to disembark. He announced that they had arrived at the next trial area, Hell Island. As the ship docked at the island, the martial artist of the Demon Palace leapt down from the deck and landed on the pier with ease. He announced to the participants that this place was Hell Island. Turning his head back toward the ship, he ordered them to follow him. After some time, they arrived at a large mound riddled with caves. The martial artist pointed at the formation and declared that all of them would be sleeping there. He instructed them to stash away their previous clothes and weapons, and to come out dressed in the prepared garments with their new swords. He told them that they were free to choose whichever cave suited them best. As Yoon-sol walked among the others, he overheard the young martial artists chatting while picking their caves. One of them commented that the place seemed acceptable, noting that he had expected it to be humid but found it surprisingly comfortable. Another complained that the cave felt tight. Nearby, Yoon-sol stumbled across two participants in the midst of an argument. One was a female warrior who insisted that she had chosen the spot first. A male martial artist snapped back, saying it was nonsense, claiming he had been there before her, and that she could not simply reserve a place because she wanted to. Before the quarrel could escalate, another participant approached, intervening and urging them not to fight, pointing out that there were plenty of suitable caves to choose from. Yoon-sol walked past the squabble silently, his thoughts drifting as he observed the others. He realized that these people had no understanding of what had happened during the second trial. Their guards were lowered, and they carried themselves without caution. Among the ones who had passed the first trial, many wore expensive clothing, clearly indicating their origins from prestigious clans. He concluded that the purpose of the second trial had been to eliminate those who could not be killed otherwise. Suddenly a voice came from behind him. The martial artist of the Demon Palace had appeared silently at his back, asking if he had not chosen yet. Yoon-sol flinched at the sudden presence and turned his head slowly. The martial artist continued, noting that Yoon-sol had been sluggish since earlier and warning him that this was not the time to waste. He addressed him directly by name, telling him not to dilly-dally. Privately, the martial artist considered why Yoon-sol had caught his attention. It was his stare that first stood out, and now it was astonishing to see that he had survived. He wondered to himself what kind of choice Yoon-sol would make here. Out loud, he urged him to hurry. Yoon-sol raised his hand and pointed toward a cave directly in front of him, saying that he would take that one. The martial artist gave him a disdainful look and remarked that of all places, Yoon-sol had chosen a spot that suited his foul attire. He declared that it disgusted him, yet as he grinned faintly, his inner thoughts betrayed his true impression. To him, Bu Yoon-sol, truly a genius. The cave seemed small and filthy on the outside, but that was only its entrance. Inside, the space was wide enough to allow proper training, and the narrow opening served a natural protection against intruders. Most avoided it after seeing the unappealing entrance, but Yoon-sol had assessed it with remarkable thoroughness. The martial artist turned away and told him to get prepared. After some time, Yoon-sol emerged in his new clothes. The participants gathered together, and the martial artist from the Demon Palace raised his voice, explaining what awaited them. He declared that Hell Island housed 10 martial arts facilities. Within each building, one could learn the martial arts of the 10 demonic sects. The choice was theirs whether to study them all, or focus on a single path. They were also given freedom over their schedules. They could sleep, play, train alone, or learn martial arts, doing whatever they desired. As Yoon-sol listened to the instructions, he narrowed his eyes and muttered quietly to himself. Something about this seemed strange. The second trial had been designed as a living hell. There was no way the Demon Palace would now allow them to simply train in peace. Meanwhile, the other participants broke into chatter among themselves. One asked which martial art they should learn first. Another quickly answered that it was obviously the Fire Rain Sword Sect's techniques, since they were rumored to be the strongest. Excited voices urged each other to hurry. Yoon-sol watched them rushing toward the same direction and continued to think. He knew the Fire Rain Sword Sect was indeed reputed as the most powerful among the demonic sects. Their martial arts would certainly prove useful to anyone who could master them. Yet for him, it was different. He had never learned martial arts before, and he concluded that even if an art was incredible, he could manage without it. Instead of following the crowd, he turned in the opposite direction. After some time, he arrived at a small, shabby house. He stopped and examined it carefully, his thoughts circling. This was the Wandering Beast Pavilion. They had fallen so far in reputation that they barely remained among the 10 demonic sects. The only reason they were still recognized was because of their long history of producing some of the strongest martial masters of past generations. His grandfather had once spoken to him about them when telling stories of the Murim. Yuan-Sol resolved that this would be his path. Before he could finish his thought, the ground beneath him began to tremble. Suddenly, a head emerged from the earth, startling him. The man asked what it was that brought him here, and whether Yuan-Sol had come seeking to become one of the 10 demon masters. The figure was Sa Wu, the secret pavilion master of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Yuan-Sol staggered at the sight of the head protruding from the ground. He went silent for a moment, then bowed respectfully and replied that he had come to learn the martial arts of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Sa Wu's eyes scanned him from head to toe. After a pause, he told him not to hasten his own death and to leave. He had no intention of teaching martial arts, especially not to someone as frail as Yuan-Sol. As Sa Wu began to lower himself back into the ground, Yuan-Sol spoke out again, saying that he had heard that learning the martial arts of the Wandering Beast Pavilion granted the power to survive anything. Sa Wu paused, surprised by his words. He admitted that he was taken aback by Yuan-Sol's knowledge of arts that were soon to fade into obscurity. But even the greatest of geniuses had difficulty mastering them, he warned. Their training began with altering the body itself, and in Yuan-Sol's current physical state, he would not survive longer than a single day. He told him to understand this and leave. Instead of retreating, Yuan-Sol dropped to his knees and bowed deeply to the ground before him. Sa Wu asked what he was doing. Yuan-Sol responded with unwavering determination that since Sa Wu had agreed to teach him, he could not fail to pay his respects to his new master. Sa Wu froze for a moment and stared at him. Then he sighed, calling him a crazy brat. After a long pause, he conceded and said that he would teach him. However, he clarified that Yuan-Sol should not be confused about his reasons. He was teaching only because the Demon Palace had ordered it. Sa Wu pulled himself fully from the ground and introduced himself formally. He declared that he was Sa Wu, the master of the Wandering Beast Pavilion, and that from this moment on, Yuan-Sol was to call him Master Sa. Yuan-Sol bowed again and introduced himself as Bu Yuan-Sol. Sa Wu cut him off sharply, declaring that he was not Bu Yuan-Sol here, but only trainee number 1. The air shifted with an intimidating weight as Sa Wu extended his hand and pointed directly at him. He ordered that they begin immediately. Sa Wu moved without hesitation. He extended 2 fingers and pressed them under Yuan-Sol's eye. Instantly, Yuan-Sol's vision began to fade into darkness. Alarm spread across his face as he exclaimed in shock that he could no longer see anything. A calm yet chilling voice echoed in his ears. It was Sa Wu, who explained that there was no need to panic. He told Yuan-Sol that he had temporarily sealed his vision using the secret techniques of the Night Pavilion. This, he said, was a necessary step in order to begin learning the Wandering Beast Path, a fundamental martial technique of the Wandering Night Pavilion. Yuan-Sol, confused but curious, asked about the Wandering Beast Path. Sa Wu elaborated. The technique heightened senses and granted reflexes akin to those of a beast. Unlike other martial arts, their methods changed drastically depending on the person learning them. Because of this, mastering the Wandering Beast Path was incredibly difficult, and over time, fewer and fewer dared to attempt it until it reached the point of near extinction. However, he explained that if one truly mastered it, they would obtain the instincts and senses of a wandering beast. Sa Wu smirked as he moved closer to Yuan-Sol. He added cruelly that most people died before ever reaching that point. Leaning in even nearer, he whispered that Yuan-Sol should be able to adjust to the loss of vision in about an hour, and that he would return at that time. Then he left. Left in silence, Yuan-Sol thought bitterly to himself. He had expected his other senses to sharpen after losing his sight, but he could not feel much change. He remembered Sa Wu had said it would take an hour, yet he decided that waiting would be too slow. He needed to adapt immediately. With determination, he began moving clumsily, stumbling and falling as he forced his body to adjust. He reminded himself that countless martial artists were competing to become one of the 10 demon masters. If he were ambushed in such a vulnerable state, he would not survive. He imagined an enemy attacking him from behind. Trying to visualize and respond, he fell again, muttering that without his vision, balance had become his most important foundation. He steadied himself and began training his movements in complete darkness. By nightfall, Sa Wu returned, yawning casually as he thought to himself that Yuan-Sol was probably lost and helpless by now. However, what he saw froze him in his tracks. Yuan-Sol was moving smoothly, his motions sharp and deliberate as if fighting an unseen opponent. Sa Wu narrowed his eyes. This was unusual. Most trainees waited passively for their other senses to compensate after losing vision, but Yuan-Sol was wildly pushing forward, imagining a false enemy and forcing his body to adapt. Perhaps this was why he had adjusted so quickly. Sa Wu stepped forward and spoke aloud, acknowledging that Yoon-sol had indeed gotten used to the blindness. He then suddenly ordered him to evade his sword. Without warning, he swung his blade directly toward him. 3 days passed. Rain poured heavily, and Yoon-sol was thrown down onto the muddy ground, his body battered from constant training. He struggled to rise again. In front of him, Sa Wu stood calmly, holding his sword. In an instant, the master rushed forward and thrust the hilt into Yoon-sol's gut, forcing him back down. Looking down at the young disciple, Sa Wu reflected silently. By the 3rd day, most trainees questioned his methods or demanded explanations, yet this boy had not. He only endured. Out loud, Sa Wu asked why Yoon-sol never questioned anything, why he did not ask how to avoid attacks or demand theories behind the training. Yoon-sol lifted his head and answered with steady determination. He reminded Sa Wu that he had said the essence of the Wandering Night Pavilion's martial arts was to reach enlightenment through one's own discovery. Because of that, he believed there must be a reason behind Sa Wu's harsh methods, and so he endured without complaint. Sa Wu froze for a moment, surprised by the answer, before smirking. He admitted that Yoon-sol was right and declared that they would continue. Without hesitation, he leaped forward again to attack. At that moment, Yoon-sol felt something he had never experienced before. His senses surged. In his thoughts, he exclaimed that he could see it, not with his eyes, but with his instincts. He could feel the sword's path. It was faint and incomplete, but it was they. He resolved that if he could not evade, then he would block instead. He lifted his weapon and intercepted Sa Wu's strike. The impact was overwhelming, sending him staggering backward, but he had blocked it. Sa Wu's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. Inwardly, he was stunned. Yoon-sol had blocked his silent attack after only 3 days of training, something no one else had ever achieved. Yoon-sol, catching his breath, muttered to himself in frustration. He had managed to block, but it was not a clean defense. The force of the blow still overpowered him. Sa Wu suddenly tossed him a piece of bamboo and ordered him to drink from it. Yoon-sol caught it, nodded gratefully, and took a sip. The moment the liquid touched his tongue, his eyes widened in shock. It was not ordinary water. Energy surged through his veins, and he felt as if the blood he had lost from countless wounds was being restored. He whispered to himself in awe, questioning what it was. Watching him from the front, Sa Wu grinned widely to himself. He thought of the truth. The liquid was none other than the ultimate spring spiritual water, something he had treasured and saved his entire life. Yet giving it to Yoon-sol did not feel like a waste, for in that moment, he realized that he had met the kind of genius that appeared only once in a lifetime. Very disciple he had been waiting for all these years. Sa Wu and Yoon-sol continued their relentless training. At last, Yoon-sol was able to block Sa Wu's strike completely, his blade holding firm under the pressure. Sa Wu smirked at the sight, a flash of approval in his eyes, before shouting for him to try receiving the attack again. He swung once more, his sword flashing toward the disciple, but this time Yoon-sol dodged quickly. Sa Wu frowned and barked that it was not good enough. In an instant, Sa Wu vanished from his position and reappeared right behind Yoon-sol, his blade already descending. Startled, Yoon-sol twisted around and managed to block the sudden attack. His chest heaved as he gasped for breath, straining to steady himself. For a moment he wondered in silence if his master had finally stopped attacking. Without warning, Sa Wu burst into wild laughter, his voice echoing through the air. He shouted joyfully that what he had been searching for all this time had been right in front of him. With that, he lifted the seal from Yoon-sol's eyes. Vision returned to Yoon-sol in an instant, and he whispered in awe to himself that he could see again. Sa Wu's expression shifted to calm seriousness as he addressed him by name. Stepping forward, he placed both hands firmly on Yoon-sol's shoulders and spoke with excitement. He told him to abandon the idea of becoming one of the 10 demon masters. Instead, he urged him to become an official disciple of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. If he agreed, Sa Wu promised that within 10 years he would raise him into one of the 10 strongest martial masters within the entire demon faction. Yoon-sol remained silent, his gaze heavy as he lowered his head. In his thoughts, he admitted to himself that the promise was not an empty boast. Based on Sa Wu's strength and the training he had endured so far, he believed his master was telling the truth. Yet the memory of his grandfather's murderer weighed heavily on him. The killer was highly skilled, and just learning the martial arts of the Wandering Beast Pavilion would never be enough. He could not be satisfied with only that. After collecting his thoughts, Yoon-sol raised his voice with conviction. He declared that he would still become a demon master. Sa Wu scoffed at the stubbornness. He told him to forget such an ambition if his reason was simply to learn the martial arts of the 10 demonic sects. Even the Grand Heavenly Demon Emperor, who was talented enough to create his own martial techniques, had not achieved such a thing. Sa Wu explained that every martial art was suited to a certain physique and type of energy. No matter how talented someone might be, they could only truly learn 2 or 3 martial arts at most. He emphasized that pursuing a single martial art with absolute dedication was the true path to becoming the strongest within the demonic faction. Despite the warning, Yun-Sol bowed his head and offered an apology. Sa Wu stared at him for a long moment, then sighed heavily as he wondered silently if there was truly no way to change his disciple's mind. Finally, he turned away and conceded. He said that in that case, he would teach him a different martial art immediately. Yun-Sol was surprised and questioned him, pointing out that he had only just learned the basics of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Sa Wu explained that the martial arts of his pavilion were not passed on merely through memorized steps or written theories. Without warning, he lunged forward and attacked Yun-Sol again. Though caught off guard, Yun-Sol managed to block the strike firmly. Sa Wu smiled with satisfaction and told him that he had already been practicing the wild beast path of the pavilion. Yun-Sol's thoughts raced. He realized then that every single sword strike Sa Wu had launched at him during training had been genuine forms of the wild beast path itself. Bowing again, he gave thanks aloud. Sa Wu dismissed the gratitude and reminded him that it had been the order of the Demon Palace. Yun-Sol, however, reminded him that he had even given him precious elixirs. He swore that he would never forget such grace. Sa Wu shook his head and told him that he should forget it. When Yun-Sol expressed confusion, Sa Wu explained that this was the nature of the Jianghu. Favors and grudges alike were best forgotten whenever possible. With respect, Yun-Sol bowed deeply to the ground and said that he would take his leave. After a moment's silence, he turned and began walking away. Sa Wu stood watching him depart, murmuring under his breath. He wondered aloud where such a hidden dragon had come from, and foresaw that a bloody storm would soon sweep across Hell Island. As Yun-Sol walked alone through the dense forest, his thoughts lingered on his training. He wondered if the reason he was sensing so much was because of the wild beast path. His senses were too sharp, and even when standing still, the overwhelming rawness of it drained him. He knew that unless he learned to control it, he would never be able to rest properly. He resolved to suppress his senses as much as possible from now on. He compared the process to stopping a falling droplet of water, and with that thought, he calmed himself. Opening a scroll, he studied it carefully. He muttered that the next step would not simply be continued training. The Demon Palace would not have sent them to Hell Island just for endless exercises. Time might already be running short. If that were the case, he had no other option but to seek out the founder of a demonic sect who had once rivaled even the Grand Heavenly Demon Emperor 700 years ago. Fire Rain Sword Emperor, Jia Huawun. He resolved that the Fire Rain Sword Sect, the strongest sect in the demonic faction and the one Jia Huawun had founded, was now his only path forward. After some time, Yun-Sol arrived before the Fire Rain Sword Sect. Standing before the towering gates, he gazed at their grandeur and compared them silently to the Wandering Beast Pavilion's martial hall. In comparison, this place looked like a palace. He knocked firmly at the door, and it soon opened. A martial artist stepped out, one whom Yun-Sol recognized as someone from the first and second trials. The man frowned in surprise and remarked that it was strange to have a visitor at such an hour. He then asked who Yun-Sol might be. The martial artist's eyes fell on him in recognition. Yun-Sol bowed respectfully and introduced himself. He declared that he had come to learn the martial arts of the Fire Rain Sword Sect. Inwardly, he noted that this was clearly a martial master of the sect. The man turned his back and commanded him to follow. Together, they walked deeper into the massive hall. As they did, the martial artist explained that the sword arts of this sect were the most expansive of including demonic martial arts, and also the most time-consuming to master. Those who had entered earlier had already passed the elementary trial and moved on to the intermediate trial. He asked why Yun-Sol had only arrived after half a month. Yun-Sol answered honestly, saying that he had been training at the Wandering Beast Pavilion during that time. The martial artist turned to glance back at him and asked with suspicion if he had learned the wild beast path. Yun-Sol confirmed that he had. The man, still doubtful, thought silently to himself. He acknowledged that the boy was a genius, but it was impossible to master the wild beast path in only half a month. More likely, he assumed, Sa Wu had grown annoyed with him and dismissed him prematurely. Still, he accepted the situation. He finally turned fully around and introduced himself. He declared that his name was Jin Gok and that he was responsible for overseeing the beginner trial. He told Yun-Sol to call him instructor. He asked if Yun-Sol truly intended to learn the Fire Rain sword art, warning that it might be better for him to attempt a different trial. Yoon-sol bowed his head respectfully and expressed his gratitude for the concern, but with determination in his voice, he declared that he fully intended to study the sword arts of the Fire Rain Sword Sect. Jin-gak nodded once and lifted his foot. He stomped down on the floor with force, and the air shook with a resounding shockwave. A massive scroll materialized beside him, and he gestured toward it. He announced that it contained the introductory form and practical method of the Fiery's 13 forms, instructing Yoon-sol to study it and train himself. Yoon-sol froze in confusion at his words. He hesitated for a moment, then raised his hand as he asked what he was supposed to do with it. Jin-gak frowned in disbelief, demanding what he meant. Surely, he asked, the boy was not claiming that he could not read a sword manual. Yoon-sol answered with honesty. He admitted that he could not. Jin-gak was stunned by his response, his eyes wide. Yoon-sol then added quietly that up until this very day, he had never once learned swordsmanship before arriving here. The admission left Jin-gak speechless. After a few moments, Jin-gak finally spoke, asking if Yoon-sol had truly never learned swordsmanship in his entire life. Yoon-sol admitted that he had not. Jin-gak reflected on this quietly. It was recorded that Yoon-sol had only ever relied on Fire Rain until now, and even during the second trial, he had not used a specific sword technique. Still, it troubled Jin-gak that Yoon-sol lacked even the most basic of skills, such as sword steps. Yet, on the other hand, he remembered the sharp observational skills and reactions Yoon-sol had demonstrated during the second trial, as well as the insight he had shown when choosing the cave dorm. If a blank canvas like him could display such qualities, Jin-gak wondered what level Yoon-sol might reach if he were properly taught. Speaking aloud again, Jin-gak asked if Yoon-sol could at least read. He then instructed him to read the manual. Yoon-sol read aloud a line that said, "Full body relaxation, softly flow into one." Jin-gak explained that full body relaxation meant to relax the body and use it flexibly when performing swordsmanship, with particular focus on relaxing the core and waist. Yoon-sol attempted the movement clumsily, asked if that was correct. Jin-gak was stunned that he had to teach such rudimentary basics in a place meant to determine the 10 demon masters. He walked over and adjusted Yoon-sol's posture himself, instructing him to stand properly once again. He reminded him that when the body was tense, the core was also tense, and stressed the importance of controlling the mind to relax and flow softly into one. Yoon-sol attempted the move once again. This time, his posture was correct, and Jin-gak was surprised to see that he understood immediately after being told only once. Smirking, Jin-gak said that his posture was sufficient and declared that he would now teach him the Fire Rain 13 forms immediately. From there, Jin-gak began instructing Yoon-sol with precision. He corrected his posture, stance, and movements sharply, observing him with strict focus. Before long, Yoon-sol was performing the technique smoothly on his own. Jin-gak's eyes widened, and a grin spread across his face as he thought to himself that his suspicions had been correct. This boy truly had talent. After watching for some time, Jin-gak gave the next instruction. He told Yoon-sol to imagine that there was an enemy in front of him and to use the Fire Rain 13 forms. Yoon-sol repeated the word enemy in uncertainty. Jin-gak confirmed it, explaining that this was the examination required to progress to the intermediate chamber. The test was to determine the sword intent contained within his basic moves. Lowering his gaze, Yoon-sol muttered that the exam had come sooner than he expected. He knew that this was his chance to prove himself. Sliding one foot into place, he took the stance of the Fire Rain 13 forms. In his mind, he envisioned an enemy that he absolutely had to defeat. A figure appeared in front of him, and he drew his sword, declaring silently that this was his enemy. He began with the first technique, Peerless Whirlwind, executing it with sharp focus. Jin-gak's eyes sharpened as he observed every movement. Yoon-sol then transitioned smoothly into the third technique, Foggy Drifting Clouds. At this sight, Jin-gak was shocked. He muttered under his breath that the technique should have been soft and spirited, akin to drifting clouds and spreading fog. Instead, Yoon-sol's execution was strangely sharp. Jin-gak wondered if Yoon-sol was consciously altering it. To alter the foundational moves of a sword technique handed down for generations was something only possible for a grandmaster. Yet these altered forms carried an undeniable killing intent, as though Yoon-sol was confronting the enemy who had slain his master or parents. For Jin-gak, it was astonishing to witness the swordsmanship of the Fire Rain Sword Sect, considered orthodox even among sword paths, being reshaped before his very eyes. He could not help but wonder what kind of life this boy had lived. Meanwhile, Yoon-sol himself noticed the strangeness in his movements. He realized that the flow at his fingertips was altering the sword paths on its own. He suspected that this might be due to the wild beast path. The more he practiced the Fire Rain 13 forms, the sharper the senses of the wild beast path became. He wanted to fuse the two completely, but if he did, it would no longer be the Fire Rain 13 forms. It would instead become an entirely new style of swordsmanship. He told himself he needed to return quickly to the original basics before losing the form completely. At that moment, however, his imagined opponent shifted into the figure of the man who had murdered his grandfather. His expression twisted with grief, and rage ignited inside him. Gritting his teeth, he charged forward and unleashed the seventh technique, overturning 4 Cs. Yet his imagined opponent only grinned and dodged the attack with ease. Yoon-sol noted with alarm that the figure was fast. He attacked again, but his enemy continued to evade every strike. Yoon-sol thought in shock that this figure was faster than anyone he had ever fought before. The enemy drew a sword and counterattacked. Yoon-sol barely managed to dodge. He muttered to himself that he could not give his opponent any space, and resolved to use the techniques he had left in one final barrage. Pouring all of his energy into his strikes, he unleashed a storm of attacks. Yet the figure continued to grin as it countered. Its blade flashed, and in one swift motion, it struck Yoon-sol, severing both his arms in the vision. Yoon-sol froze in shock, gasping for breath, before dropping his sword. On the sidelines, Jin-gak had been watching with sharp focus. He concluded that in the end, Yoon-sol had lost. Yet a smirk tugged at his lips as he spoke aloud, telling Yoon-sol that he had passed. Yoon-sol, still bent over as he caught his breath, looked up in confusion and asked for clarification. Jin-gak explained that the test of the elementary chamber was not about victory or defeat, but rather about demonstrating one's understanding of the sword and the execution of the Fire Rain 13 forms in a real combat scenario. He kicked up Yoon-sol's fallen sword, caught it, and handed it back to him. He told him that his display had been more than sufficient proof and that his execution of the Fire Rain 13 forms was incredible. With that, he instructed Yoon-sol to proceed to the intermediate chamber. Yoon-sol accepted the sword and muttered in his heart that instructor Jin-gak must have found it troublesome to teach someone with no background in swordsmanship, yet he had guided him step by step with patience. Bowing respectfully, he expressed his gratitude. Jin-gak smiled and told him to continue working even harder from now on. His tone then shifted as he warned Yoon-sol that his sword carried a particularly strong killing intent, and that he must be careful not to be consumed by it. Yoon-sol lowered his gaze without responding. After a moment, he bowed once more and turned to leave. As he departed, Jin-gak thought to himself that it was indeed true. Yoon-sol had really mastered the wild beast path in just 2 weeks. Perhaps it was due to his astonishing learning speed. Regardless, he was advancing to the intermediate chamber far faster than anyone had expected. At first, Jin-gak had doubted whether he could make it that far at all, but now he was certain. The instructor of the intermediate chamber would surely become obsessed with Bu Yoon-sol in the end. When Yoon-sol opened the door to the intermediate chamber, the instructor and the other participants turned to glance at him. Without hesitation, the instructor spoke directly, telling him that he did not care who he was, but other spots had already been filled. He ordered him to leave immediately. This man was Chan Woongang, the intermediate trial instructor of the Fire Rain Sword Sect. Chan Woongang glared at Yoon-sol and spoke through clenched teeth. He remarked that Yoon-sol seemed to have passed through the elementary chamber by relying on fear alone. It had taken him more than 20 days just to learn the Fire Rain 13 forms. And with such limited talent, Chan Woongang claimed, he would only waste time by remaining in this chamber. Yoon-sol lowered his head respectfully and replied that his delay was because he had spent 2 weeks at the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Chan Woongang raised his brows and asked if that was the case, questioning whether it was not instead because he had been slow to learn the elementary teachings. Inwardly, he considered the matter carefully. The Wandering Beast Pavilion was infamous for its wild beast path, and he suspected that Yoon-sol might have attempted to learn it midway through his training. After a pause, Chan Woongang conceded and spoke aloud, granting Yoon-sol permission to take a seat since he had technically passed the elementary chamber's teachings. However, he added that he doubted how well Yoon-sol would be able to follow the next stage of training. Without wasting time, Chan Woongang resumed his instruction to the gathered participants. He explained that the Fire Rain Thundering Sword was a style built on rapid movements. If one lacked sufficient skill with the sword, they would end up hurting themselves. Like the Fire Rain 13 forms, this martial art was difficult to use in real combat, but even so, it was still considered basic. They were required to learn it as part of the process. He emphasized that their main goal would not be simply to win, but to sharpen their swordsmanship. Calling out a name, Chan Wongang ordered Byok Hansung to come forward and select an opponent for a duel. Byok Hansung stepped out with a confident grin and asked if he was free to choose anyone. When Chan Wongang confirmed this, Byok Hansung smirked and pointed at Yunsol, declaring that he chose him. Chan Wongang immediately tried to intervene, beginning to protest that Yunsol had only just completed the elementary chamber. However, Byok Hansung quickly interrupted him, reminding him that he had been told he could choose anyone. Irritation flickered across Chan Wonggang's face, and he muttered under his breath about the fool's arrogance. Speaking louder, he demanded what sense there was in testing one's sword against someone who had barely completed the elementary chamber. He urged Byok Hansung to select someone else. Before the situation could be settled, Yunsol interjected. He said that he had no problem with the duel. Chan Wongang turned on him in shock, exclaiming at his audacity. Yunsol stood up and explained himself. He stated that he had learned swordsmanship under instructor Jin Gak of the elementary trial. If he tested his skills against others, he believed he would be able to improve at a faster pace. Chan Wongang narrowed his gaze. Inwardly, he judged that Yunsol was trying to protect his pride with skills only partially learned from the elementary chamber. After a heavy sigh, he finally pointed toward the wooden swords nearby and allowed the duel to proceed. He remarked that knowing one's own ability was itself an important skill for any martial artist, and expressed hope that Yunsol would prove himself capable enough to reach the advanced chamber. Meanwhile, Byok Hansung muttered to himself, still grinning with excitement. He considered it a stroke of luck. In a chamber filled with talented geniuses, it would have been difficult to make himself stand out. But if he killed this latecomer, he would be able to solidify his own position. The two faced one another in the center and bowed in the traditional manner before combat. Byok Hansung then sneered and announced aloud that Yunsol had guts. But guts alone were never enough to survive in the world of Murim. Chan Wongang raised his voice and gave the signal to begin. Byok Hansung moved first. In an instant, he lunged forward, swinging his sword in a horizontal slash. Yunsol ducked low to avoid the attack, closely observing his opponent's movements. Byok Hansung immediately followed with another strike, laughing loudly as he shouted that it was not a bad attempt. Yunsol firmly blocked the attack, steady on his feet. Byok Hansung felt the sensation of their swords clashing, and muttered to himself with a sneer that the boy really was a beginner. His grin widened as he declared he would demonstrate the fire rain thundering sword. He unleashed the technique, laughing as he struck again and again. However, his laughter slowly began to falter when he noticed that Yunsol was evading smoothly. Each time, Yunsol stepped aside with calm precision. Inside his own thoughts, Yunsol analyzed his opponent. He realized that Byok Hansung was performing the forms correctly, and that he truly was putting the fire rain thundering sword into practice. Chan Wongang observed the duel carefully. He noted that Byok Hansung's sword lacked depth, while Yunsol was not dodging through speed but rather through prediction. His movements seemed as though he already knew what would come next. The instructor's eyes narrowed in disbelief as he wondered if Yunsol could truly have learned the Wild Beast Path, but that was supposed to be impossible. The Wild Beast Path was known as the foundational martial art of the Wander Beast Pavilion, and even veteran masters struggled to learn it. For a boy to master it in only 2 weeks seemed absurd. Chan Wongang stomped his foot in frustration and shouted that only dodging made it difficult to judge. He reminded Yunsol that this duel was not to test reflexes but to measure swordsmanship. Hearing this, Yunsol stopped avoiding and shifted into offense. His blade moved, and the gathered participants gasped in shock. They recognized the form and muttered among themselves that he was performing the Fire Rain 13 forms. Byok Hansung scoffed at the sight and dismissed the attempt. He said that it was nothing more than the Fire Rain 13 forms. Among the onlookers, one of the participants watched closely. Her eyes widened, and she realized something. She thought to herself that Yunsol's execution was subtly different from the ordinary forms. Byok Hansung laughed confidently, said he could dodge such attacks with his eyes closed. But his grin faltered when Yunsol's strike grazed him, slicing off strands of his hair. He stiffened, his eyes widening in disbelief. Inside, he thought that this was not an imitation but the true Fire Rain 13 forms. As the exchange continued, Byok Hansung began to struggle, blocking desperately against Yunsol's onslaught. He gritted his teeth and muttered to himself in frustration, wondering if Yunsol had intentionally used a distorted variation earlier to mock him. Perhaps, he thought bitterly. Yoon-sol was doing this only to catch the attention of the instructor and advance directly to the advanced chamber. In his desperation, Byuk Hansung's fury exploded. He roared that he would be the one to rise to the advanced chamber and unleashed a vicious strike, crying out the name of the Asura Sword Sect's lethal move, blood-shattering strike. Chan Won-gang's eyes widened from the sidelines. He recognized the forbidden technique instantly, and admitted inwardly that he had never forbidden them from using other sword styles. Still, he was astonished to see such a deadly art brought into the duel, yet his attention quickly returned to Yoon-sol. What truly startled him was that even in the face of such overwhelming pressure, the boy's footwork and stance did not falter. His balance remained unshaken. The thought struck him sharply. Perhaps this child truly had managed to learn the wild beast path. On the battlefield, Byuk Hansung shouted again in frustration, calling Yoon-sol a brat who only knew how to dodge. He vowed that this would be the end. He leapt high into the air and unleashed another fearsome move, Bloody Wind Warding Moon. Chan Won-gang's eyes widened again and he realized the sheer danger of the incoming attack. But at that critical moment, Yoon-sol moved swiftly. He blocked the assault and immediately turned, flowing seamlessly into his counter. The chamber erupted in gasps of shock as he performed the Fire Rain 13 form's final technique. His sword pierced forward with Infinite and Boundless, the 13th form, driving directly into Byuk Hansung's chest. Blood burst from Byuk Hansung's mouth as his eyes widened in disbelief. His body collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud. Yoon-sol lowered his sword and stood silently, staring down at his fallen opponent. The other participants recoiled in shock. Their voices trembled as one of them cried out loudly, declaring in horror that Byuk Hansung had died. Chan Won-gang slowly approached Byuk Hansung's fallen body, while Yoon-sol set the wooden sword aside. Standing over the corpse, the instructor lowered his gaze and thought grimly to himself that the young man was dead, struck precisely in a vital spot. He then turned his eyes toward Yoon-sol and asked whether he had always been a disciple of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Yoon-sol shook his head and answered that he had not. Won-gang pressed further, demanding to know if Yoon-sol was claiming to have perfectly mastered the wild beast path in just 2 weeks. Yoon-sol calmly replied that he had only learned the basics. At this, Won-gang scoffed and accused him of lying, remarking bitterly that perhaps the Wandering Beast Pavilion now taught its disciples deceit as well. As Yoon-sol began to respond, Won-gang cut him off. Glancing once more at Byuk Hansung's corpse, he told him that he had no need for excuses and ordered him to clean up the mess immediately. The other participants erupted in protest. They cried out that committing murder during a normal sparring session was absurd, and they questioned whether Yoon-sol should be punished for such an act. Won-gang's tone shifted sharply as he fixed them with a hard glare. He told them not to be mistaken. Just because the place was called a martial chamber did not mean it was truly one. This, he reminded them coldly, was Hell Island. If one used a killing technique, then one had to be prepared to die in return. With that, he announced that the trial would resume. After a while, the participants paired off and began dueling once again. When the matches concluded, those who had lost gathered together before Won-gang. He told them flatly that they had failed the trial and ordered them to leave immediately to seek another martial chamber to train in. One of the defeated participants hesitated and pleaded, stammering that it had only been a single test and asked whether they could not be given another chance. Won-gang denied the request without hesitation. He explained that they had likely passed the beginning trials because they were physically fit, but to earn the Fire Rain sword required more than fitness. It demanded potential, talent, and the willingness to endure blood, sweat, and tears in order to surpass one's own limits. They had failed because they lacked those qualities. Turning his back to them, he dismissed them harshly, telling them to get out. Once the group left, Won-gang noticed that someone remained behind. Yoon-sol still stood in the chamber. The two locked eyes in silence until Won-gang finally asked why he had not left. Yoon-sol responded by asking if he was required to leave as well. Won-gang told him that he had won his duel and passed the trial, so he should proceed to the advanced trial. Yoon-sol, however, insisted that he wished to remain in the intermediate chamber, stating that he wanted to advance further but preferred to stay where he was. Won-gang paused for a moment before questioning why. Yoon-sol explained that the only sword technique he had learned so far was the Fire Rain 13 forms, and that he had yet to learn anything from the intermediate chamber. Won-gang frowned and challenged his statement, pointing out that Yoon-sol had already learned the wild beast path, and had even seen through the techniques of the Asura Sword Sect, yet he still claimed he had learned nothing. Yoon-sol affirmed this without hesitation. Wongang scoffed softly and then accepted his decision. He said he would teach him the Fire Rain Thundering Sword. 13 forms. However, his expression hardened as he added a warning. He told Yoon-sol that he despised those who played little tricks in order to make an impression. If he discovered that Yoon-sol had secretly learned any other sword techniques apart from the Fire Rain 13 forms, he would not hesitate to behead him immediately. 4 days later, Woon-gang observed Yoon-sol practicing the sword technique. His strikes were sharp, his movements focused. The instructor thought silently to himself, marveling at the boy's growth. Over the past 4 days, he had examined him in every possible way, and he had confirmed that Yoon-sol truly had no fundamental training in swordsmanship before this. He really was a complete novice who had just begun to learn. Yet his determination and concentration were remarkable. It was as though his very life depended on mastering martial arts. Smirking faintly, Woon-gang admitted inwardly that he now understood how Yoon-sol had been able to master the wild beast path in just 2 weeks. At that moment, Yoon-sol performed the Fire Rain Thundering Sword, Extreme Lightning. Woon-gang raised his hand and commanded him to stop. He stepped forward and told him he could stop now, for it seemed that he had already grasped the principles of the Fire Rain Thundering Sword. Yoon-sol, breathing heavily, looked surprised and tried to speak, but Woon-gang cut him off. He explained that the Fire Rain Thundering Sword was a technique that twisted the body quickly so that the moves could be connected in sequence. All of its forms involved swinging the sword around oneself, making it ineffective in real combat. Yet Yoon-sol was attempting to wield it as if he were truly in a fight, using it with intent to kill. Catching his breath, Yoon-sol asked whether that was not the true point of sword techniques. Woon-gang answered firmly that murderous intent was indeed necessary for demonic martial arts, but in order to ascend to a higher realm of martial prowess, the Fire Rain Sword also required the aspect of killing. He placed his finger against Yoon-sol's forehead and warned him that if he could not rid himself of the murderous intent in his mind, then his martial arts would eventually harm him instead of strengthening him. Yoon-sol touched his forehead and thought back to what instructor Jin-gak had once told him. The words were nearly identical. Woon-gang continued, speaking of his own past. He admitted that he too had lived with murderous intent in his heart, cutting down all who stood in his way. Because of that, he had lost both honor and pride, and in turn, his martial prowess had fallen. He reflected that while techniques designed to kill might feel as though they could elevate one's martial level, they were in truth obstacles on the endless path of swordsmanship. He told Yoon-sol bluntly that he needed to abandon his murderous intent. Yoon-sol listened and suddenly recalled his grandfather's words from when he was still a child. His grandfather had once told him that those who wielded the sword carried a past stained with despair and misfortune, which was why warriors of Murim hated to speak of their pasts. Remembering this, Yoon-sol asked Woon-gang why he was telling him such things. Woon-gang paused for a moment, before answering that he had already said why. He too had once lived with murder in his heart. The instructor then asked Yoon-sol for his name. Yoon-sol gave it, stating that he was Bu Yoon-sol. Woon-gang let out a scoff and recalled that he had heard the name before. So this was the boy who had survived the second trial, the same one Jin-gak had mentioned. He warned him that he had a serious problem. Alarmed, Yoon-sol asked what it was. Woon-gang explained that he lacked the basic foundation of martial arts. His competitors had been learning since childhood, and if he tried to learn the Fire Rain Sword in the advanced chamber without a foundation, the gap between them would only widen. He needed to master the basics quickly so that he could build upon them. Woon-gang declared that from now on he would teach him the unrivaled lightning and thunder, a technique of his own creation. However, he gave a stern warning. In the process of trying to master this art, he had destroyed the nerve endings in his own fingers, rendering them useless. That was how dangerous the technique was. If Yoon-sol failed, he might lose control over his entire arms, not move on to the advanced chamber, and end up crippled instead. He asked whether Yoon-sol was prepared for that risk. Yoon-sol's thoughts lingered on the possibility of losing his arms, but he did not hesitate. He bowed firmly and thanked him. Then, with a quiet determination, he muttered that for the sake of revenge, he was willing to give up even his soul. After a month had passed, Yoon-sol finally advanced to the chamber beyond the intermediate stage. As he walked toward the entrance, he reflected silently to himself. It had taken him an entire month to learn the unrivaled lightning and thunder and leave the intermediate chamber behind. Although his instructor had said that his progress was fast, he still felt that it had taken longer than he had expected. After first mastering the basic martial arts of the elementary chamber and then the sword techniques of the intermediate chamber, he thought that it was now time to proceed further. When Yoon-sol opened the heavy doors of the advanced chamber, All heads turned toward him. At the front of the hall, the old instructor fixed him with a sharp glare. Yunsol paused for a moment, observing the aura within the room. He muttered softly to himself that the advanced chamber truly carried a different energy. The atmosphere was far fiercer, and within the eyes of the trainees, he sensed a predatory focus. Nobody looked at him with disdain any longer. He realized it must have been because he had killed Byuk Hansung. The thought made him reflect bitterly. Cleaning a corpse was considered a lowly task, yet killing a man with a sword was something others praised. Breaking his thoughts, the instructor spoke. With a warm smile, he addressed Yunsol, acknowledging him as the fiery soul he had heard of. He told him that he had been just about to begin the lesson and instructed Yunsol to sit. As Yunsol moved to take a place on the floor, the instructor began speaking once more, explaining for the sake of the new trainee the central teachings of the Fire Rain Sword along with the 7 principles. Power, he explained, must be distributed evenly throughout the entire body. One must strive for balance. He instructed the students to pull in their chest and push out their back. He warned them not to place all of their energy into a single strike. As Yunsol listened closely, he realized within his thoughts that he would not have been able to understand this lecture if he had not already learned the advanced martial arts of the intermediate chamber. When the instructor concluded his lecture, he ended the verbal teachings for the day. He then called out to Yunsol by name and told him to follow. Together, the two left the hall. As they walked outside, the instructor touched the leaves of the trees along the path. He spoke calmly, explaining that there existed a realm where one without a sword could defeat one who carried one. To be more exact, he said that such a person no longer needed a sword in order to form sword arts. He then plucked a branch from a nearby tree. Without warning, he swung it at Yunsol, stopping just an inch from his face. His expression hardened into a grim look as he asked a question. If Yunsol were to be attacked suddenly, just like now, yet lacked a sword, how would he respond with sword martial arts? Yunsol stood stunned at the unexpected action. The instructor continued his explanation. While Yunsol had been training in the intermediate chamber, the trainees in the advanced chamber had already learned the Shining Mystique, the first form of the Fire Rain Sword, and were now discussing its theories. If Yunsol could not understand his question, then he would not teach him further. He warned Yunsol to answer carefully. After taking a moment to steady himself, Yunsol closed his eyes in deep thought. Finally, he opened them wide and lunged forward, declaring his answer. If there was no sword in his hand, then he would use his opponent's sword. As his hand reached for the branch, the instructor sidestepped effortlessly. Yunsol froze in shock and confusion, unable to comprehend when the instructor had moved behind him. The instructor told him that his choice had been too hasty. Gritting his teeth, Yunsol turned. Stunned by the man's speed, he leapt forward again, trying to seize the branch, but once more the instructor dodged easily. Yunsol thought in frustration that he could not even predict the man's movements. He had not expected to succeed in catching the branch, but the fact that he could not follow the instructor's movements at all was humiliating. He told himself that if he could not impress the instructor here, he would not be allowed to remain in the advanced chamber. Determined, he decided to push the wild beast path to its limits, heightening his senses completely so that he could read the flow of direction. Once more, Yunsol spun and lunged with everything he had, his sharpened senses guiding him. Even if it was only once, he swore he would seize the branch. But just as he closed in and his hand reached for it, the instructor released a powerful surge of chi. The force blasted Yunsol backward through the air. He crashed hard to the ground. As he struggled to rise, the instructor approached him, placed a hand firmly on his shoulder, and let out a booming laugh of satisfaction. He declared that Yunsol had passed. Confused, Yunsol muttered to himself, wondering how he could have passed when he had not even touched the branch. The instructor simply told him that he would begin learning the Shining Mystique starting the next day, and ordered him to come early in the morning, earlier than the others. Yunsol stood, bowed deeply, and answered with determination that he understood. As Yunsol walked away, the instructor looked down at the branch in his hand. The leaves slowly began to fall from it. His gaze turned cold as he remarked that even a cub was still a wolf. He then chuckled softly and said he had high expectations for Yunsol. Later, as Yunsol made his way through the forest, he muttered that his lesson for the day was over. He debated whether to rest or to circulate his chi. Perhaps, he thought, he should explore Hell Island further. He reminded himself that after what had happened during the second trial, no one could predict when a fight might break out here. Suddenly, he froze. From behind him, he felt multiple presences. He quickly counted in his mind. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A group of participants stepped out. One of them sneered. telling Yoon-sol that he had been acting out of place ever since the intermediate chamber, and that they would teach him a lesson. Another added with a grin that since Yoon-sol had been the first to kill someone, he should not blame them for what was about to happen. A third spoke up, boasting that the 5 of them were known as the 5-peak swords, geniuses among geniuses, and that he had better prepare himself. Yoon-sol narrowed his eyes, muttering to himself that they were wrong. There was one more presence. He shifted into his stance, readying himself for battle. One of the trainees shouted angrily, demanding to know if Yoon-sol truly intended to fight them. Before he could finish speaking, a sharp blow struck the back of his head. The man collapsed to the ground instantly. The remaining participants turned in shock. Their eyes widened in horror as they recognized the figure standing behind them. Their voices trembled as they cried out her name, Seo Jinha. Seo Jinha's cold gaze fixed directly on Yoon-sol. Her eyes widened, and in a chilling tone she told him that they needed to talk. The other participants shouted in shock when they saw her. They called out Seo Jinha's name and demanded to know why she was there. Seo Jinha responded coldly without hesitation. She told them to fuck off and added that she had no business with losers like them. Her words carried so much weight that the participants instantly backed away. As they fled, they shouted threats, promising that they would get her later for this. Seo Jinha only scoffed as she watched them retreat. She called them cowards before her gaze shifted toward Eun-seol. Turning her attention fully to him, she spoke in a sharp tone. She told him that she would ask directly. She pointed her sword toward him and demanded to know whose side he was on. Yoon-sol's eyes narrowed at the sudden question. At that moment, he recalled a memory from his training inside the advanced chamber. He remembered standing among the trainees as the instructor spoke from the stage, addressing them all. The instructor had reminded them that they had learned the first technique of the Fire Rain sword. He explained that they could only claim to have mastered it once they made it their own. The instructor then said it was time to see the fire rain drops each of them had created. The instructor had called Yoon-sol forward by name. A few moments later, Yoon-seol had stood on the stage with his sword in his hand. He remembered sighing deeply, sharpening his gaze, and performing the technique. Once he finished, the instructor had quietly muttered to himself. He noted that Yoon-sol's technique was grounded and precise, but it was also filled with murderous intent. The instructor then spoke aloud, telling Yoon-sol to return to his spot before calling for the next student. Seo Jinha had stepped forward then, passing Yoon-sol on her way to the stage. Yoon-sol had watched her carefully as she performed her technique. He had realized immediately that she had not demonstrated the basic form of the Fire Rain sword. Instead, she showed a variation designed to counter his technique directly. To him, it felt as though she had deliberately issued a warning. Now, standing in the present moment before her, Yoon-seol asked what she meant by questioning whose side he was on. Seo Jinha did not soften her tone. She yelled at him, telling him not to play dumb. She declared that she knew not everyone had come to the Demon Palace because they wanted to become one of the 10 Demon Masters. Yoon-sol paused at her words. In his thoughts, he admitted that learning the martial arts of the 10 demonic sects alone was an incredible opportunity. Yet the actual process of participating had been executed in such a strange and unsettling manner that it seemed suspicious. He reasoned that such a rare chance was not only a blessing, but also a trap designed to capture something hidden. At last, Yoon-seol asked her directly if she was suggesting that there was a spy. Seo Jinha's eyes sharpened at his response. She muttered under her breath as she studied his face and tone, realizing that he was not lying. Clicking her tongue, she said aloud that it was not him. With clear disappointment, she admitted that she had wanted to have some fun. She turned around to leave and warned him with a menacing gaze. She told him to stop acting out of line, and if he continued to get on her nerves, she would kill him too. Yoon-seol watched her as she walked away, thinking deeply to himself. The mention of a spy made him realize that there was much more happening beneath the surface than he had expected. He admitted that it made sense he had not noticed before, since he had been focusing solely on learning the martial arts of the Wandering Beast Pavilion and the Fire Rain Sword Sect. He looked up at the sky and muttered aloud that he did not believe he needed to pay it much mind. Whether it was a spy or a demonic martial artist, it would not change the fact that they were opponents he would eventually have to face. He concluded in his heart that the real battle would begin soon. A few days later, Yoon-seol returned to the advanced chamber for another lesson. The instructor stood before the trainees and announced that their training was coming to an end. He admitted that many of them likely thought learning the laws of martial arts had been boring, but he explained that true martial masters, those who had fought countless real battles, also took time to study the underlying principles. To know martial arts, he said, did not mean one could always act them out, and to act them out did not mean one truly knew them. He emphasized that the analysis of the laws they had studied would serve as stepping stones on their journey into the Murim. He concluded by wishing them good luck. Suddenly, a bell rang out across the island, its echoes spreading through the air. The trainees immediately began to chatter among themselves, ask what the bell meant. The instructor raised his hand to quiet them and told them that it was time. He ordered them to go to the stone mountain at the center of the island. Later, after all the trainees gathered at the central mountain, they lined up in formation. In front of them stood Instructor Jin Gak and Head Instructor Hyuk Ryeon-young. Jin Gak reported to the head instructor that everyone had arrived. Hyuk Ryeon-young looked out into the crowd until his eyes found Yoon-sol. Yoon-sol gave him a slight nod in return. The head instructor then spoke loudly for all to hear. He declared that the third trial was about to begin. The trainees grew restless as they whispered among themselves in confusion. Many of them asked each other what the head instructor meant. They wondered aloud if he had said the third trial, not the second. On the side, Yoon-sol glared at the others and thought to himself that they had misunderstood. For him, the fight to the death earlier had already been the second trial. He admitted that he could not speak for the others, but he was certain of his own conclusion. Jin Gak suddenly stomped his left foot against the ground and raised his voice in a commanding tone. He declared that all the caves would soon be closed and that the trainees would no longer be able to return to their chambers until the 10 demon masters were chosen. He ordered them to collect whatever items they needed now. The announcement shocked the trainees. One of them raised his hand and asked how exactly the 10 demon masters would be selected. Jin Gak began to respond, saying that it would be determined in a certain way. But before he could continue, Head Instructor Hyuk Ryeon-young cut him off. Hyuk Ryeon-young spoke with contempt, saying he could not believe they called themselves potential members of the Demon Palace, yet had failed to realize the truth. He shoved his hand to the side and yelled in a commanding voice. He ordered them to kill each other. He told them to eliminate one another until only 10 remained standing. He demanded that they understand his command. Some of the trainees were horrified, while others grinned with excitement at the prospect. Hyuk Ryeon-young continued. He said they were free to hide or run if they wished, but warned them that they could not do so forever. At that moment, masked figures appeared at the edge of the gathering. Hyuk Ryeon-young continued his explanation, telling them that as time passed, the areas in which they were allowed to remain would be restricted. Any who lingered in the forbidden zones would be slain by these masked figures, whom he referred to as killer demons. Yoon-sol gritted his teeth the moment he sensed them. Even at a distance, their killing intent was overwhelming. Seo Jinha, standing elsewhere, froze in shock as she realized the level of power they possessed. In her mind, she concluded that they must be incredible martial artists. One of the trainees raised his hand and asked if they were allowed to attack the killer demons. Hyuk Ryeon-young burst into laughter at the question. He praised the trainee for having such lofty goals and told them, of course, they could fight the killer demons. He added that if any of them were capable of it, they could even kill one. With a wide grin, he revealed a further rule. Anyone who succeeded in killing a killer demon would immediately be acknowledged as one of the 10 demon masters. The trainees murmured among themselves in horror. They realized that killing a single killer demon would be far more difficult than killing every other trainee present. Hyuk Ryeon-young raised his voice once again. He reminded them that they were free to team up or ambush each other. If they had the ability to kill, he ordered them to do so at all costs. That, he said, was the path to becoming one of the 10 demon masters. Moments later, the trainees began to scatter in different directions. Yoon-sol quickly ran as well. In his thoughts, he reminded himself that he needed to move quickly. He knew he had already drawn too much attention to himself among the other candidates. If he lingered, he risked being ambushed by a group just like before. He resolved to find a safe place immediately. He thought carefully and decided where the safest place for him would be. Yoon-sol soon arrived outside the Wandering Beast Hall. He stopped in his tracks as he noticed something unusual. He muttered to himself as he realized the ground beneath his feet felt different from before. He crouched down and touched the earth. He was about to examine it more closely when his thoughts were interrupted. His senses picked up movement nearby. Someone was coming. From the bushes, a man burst forth, yelling desperately for help. He shouted that someone was trying to kill him. Yoon-sol immediately gripped his sword and drew it halfway from its sheath, ready to respond. The man, catching his breath, pleaded for assistance. He promised that if Yoon-sol helped him, he would repay the favor. Yoon-sol studied him carefully and judged that it was not a trick. He noted that the man's wounds were real. His senses told him that 3 others were pursuing the man. He wondered if they were acting as a team. He admitted to himself that he did not want to get involved. However, he also realized that the man's loud cries might reveal his location to the pursuers, which would be even worse. Acting swiftly, Yoon-sul brushed away dirt from the ground, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the earth. He pulled it open, and both of them slipped down inside. A short while later, the pursuers arrived, searching the area. From inside the hidden space, Yoon-sul and the injured man listened as the others shouted in frustration. One declared that there was no way the fugitive had escaped already. Another cursed and promised to kill him for sure. They decided he could not have gone far and moved on quickly, scattering into the forest. Yoon-sul waited silently until their footsteps faded away. Then he cautiously lifted his head and emerged from the underground hideout. The injured man followed, gasping for breath in relief. Yoon-sul brushed dirt from his body calmly, while the other man exclaimed that he had survived thanks to him. He admitted that if it had not been for Yoon-sul's help, he would already be dead. The man stopped speaking when he noticed Yoon-sul was lost in thought. Yoon-sul reflected silently that the hole had not been dug merely for hiding. He realized that Mr. Sa must have prepared it for him specifically. While he had been underground, he had felt something new. Through the dirt, he sensed the sensations of the wild beast path expanding far beyond its usual range. He had felt the vibrations of the earth as the pursuers pushed against the dirt. He had heard the movements of their swords. Through these vibrations, he could sense everything around him as if he were seeing it with his own eyes. He concluded that this was the essence of the wild beast path, a technique that relied on vibrations. Mr. Sa must have intended for him to learn this. When his thoughts settled, Yoon-sul's gaze shifted back to the man beside him. He studied him from head to toe. The stranger quickly introduced himself in a cheerful tone, saying that his name was Gyeom Cholyong and that he belonged to the Blood Sect. He asked politely if he could know Yoon-sul's name. Yoon-sul gave no response. He turned away in silence and began walking forward. Gyeom Cholyong called out to him frantically, begging him to wait. When Yoon-sul did not answer, Cholyong hurried to follow behind him. As the two of them walked together through the forest, Gyeom Cholyong began to chatter incessantly. He said that he had escaped into the forest as soon as the third trial began. He confessed that he had been terrified, but the others had pursued him relentlessly. Yoon-sul turned his head slightly at the man's words. Gyeom Cholyong continued speaking, asking if it would be acceptable for him to join Yoon-sul. He explained that since Yoon-sul had helped him hide earlier, he felt he could be trusted. Yoon-sul turned his head away without answering, but Gyeom Cholyong grinned and declared excitedly that he would take the silence as a yes. As time passed, Yoon-sul pressed his palm against the ground and quietly sensed the vibrations that traveled through the earth around them. After a moment, he concluded aloud that they would have to find a different route because a fight was happening nearby. Gyeom Cholyong, who was following from behind, widened his eyes in awe. He exclaimed that Yoon-sul could feel the vibrations through the ground and asked excitedly to be taught how to do the same. Yoon-sul, however, gave no response. He rose to his feet in silence and began walking forward. Suddenly, a chilling voice echoed inside his head. The voice swore that even if it meant selling its soul, it would avenge the deaths of its fellow disciples. Yoon-sul paused at the words and thought to himself that the desire for revenge carried a hatred that felt strangely familiar. His expression immediately shifted. Gyeom Cholyong noticed the change and asked what was wrong. Yoon-sul turned around and stated firmly that there had been a change of plans. He told him that they would be joining the battle. The two of them crouched low behind the bushes to observe. At that moment, another trainee who had been hiding in the branches of a tree above them leaped down and launched a surprise attack. Yoon-sul had already anticipated the strike and raised his sword in time to block it. The trainee's eyes widened in disbelief. He shouted aloud, demanding to know how Yoon-sul had managed to stop the forbidden ultimate concealment technique. He asked if Yoon-sul was also an assassin. Yoon-sul did not answer. Instead, he shoved the attacker's weapon aside with his sword and countered with a single swift slash that cut the trainee down instantly. The young man collapsed to the ground lifeless. Yoon-sul looked at the body and thought to himself that the assassin's concealment technique might have been a troublesome ability had he not studied the wild beast path. Behind him, Gyeom Cholyong screamed in panic as blood splattered onto his face. He shouted in disgust, trembling at the sight. Yoon-sul ignored him and remained focused on the distant battlefield. With his heightened senses, he observed the ongoing clash and silently wondered to himself whether, if he aided the lone survivor by eliminating the assassins, the man would tell him what it felt like to finally achieve revenge. At the battlefield ahead, one trainee knelt on the ground, his body soaked in blood and riddled with wounds. He was surrounded by 3 others. One of them declared that it was over, and urged his comrades to finish the fight quickly so they could leave. Out of respect, he promised to give the kneeling trainee a swift death since he was the last one standing. Before they could act, one of the trainees noticed movement from behind. Yoon-sol suddenly rushed in and launched an attack. The targeted trainee managed to block his first strike and shouted in shock, asking why there were more enemies. Yoon-sol pressed the attack relentlessly, forcing his opponent to dodge and block in desperation. Another trainee appeared from behind and attempted to strike Yoon-sol in the back. At the last moment, Yoon-sol ducked down, and the attacker's blade cut down his own comrade standing in front. The one from behind roared in fury, calling Yoon-sol a bastard. The remaining 2 survivors then charged at him together. Yoon-sol braced himself and retaliated, landing a clean hit on one while simultaneously blocking the other's strike. He stepped back quickly to create distance, but his opponent screamed in rage and charged forward, intent on killing him. Before the attacker could land a blow, blood suddenly splattered across Yoon-sol's face. The heavily injured trainee who had been kneeling moments earlier rose to his feet and struck from behind, cutting down the enemy. With a wild gleam in his eyes, he swung again, slicing the second attacker cleanly in half. He then erupted into loud, unrestrained laughter. Yet the sound soon faded as his strength failed him. His body staggered, and he collapsed to the ground. With his final breath, he muttered that he had at last achieved his revenge. Yoon-sol looked down at the corpse in silence. The quiet was broken when Guillaume Cholyong emerged nervously from the bushes and asked if it was finally over. As he approached, Yoon-sol crouched beside the fallen body, examining the young man who had died after fulfilling his vengeance. Guillaume Cholyong remarked that Yoon-sol was indeed skilled, but even so. His words suddenly stopped. His innocent expression twisted into something far darker. A menacing grin spread across his face as he drew his weapon and declared in a chilling tone that Yoon-sol should not have let his guard down. He lunged forward, swinging his weapon to strike from behind. Yet Yoon-sol was already prepared. He turned and blocked the attack with his sword. Guillaume Cholyong froze in shock and demanded to know how Yoon-sol had managed to anticipate him. Yoon-sol shoved his blade aside and stood, stating coldly that it was Guillaume Cholyong's own fault. He began walking forward with a steady, chilling stride, and told him that because of his betrayal, he had not been able to ask the question he wanted. Guillaume Cholyong screamed at him in frustration, asking what he was talking about, and when he had realized the truth, Yoon-sol answered bluntly that he had known from the very start. Stunned, Guillaume Cholyong shouted in disbelief. Yoon-sol explained further. When they had hidden underground, he had noticed the numerous hidden weapons concealed beneath Guillaume Cholyong's clothes. His stiff and unnatural movements had given him away immediately. Yoon-sol admitted that the only reason he had kept him close was because he had been curious to see what he would do. He had thought that observing the way a deceiver carried out his schemes might be useful for the future. Guillaume Cholyong trembled with rage, grinding his teeth. He insisted that it was impossible and that his acting had been flawless. He then hurled his hidden weapons toward Yoon-sol in fury. Yoon-sol dodged the attack effortlessly, his cold gaze never leaving his opponent. Guillaume Cholyong's thoughts raced as he clenched his jaw. Despite his efforts, he could not shake the feeling that this man could predict his every move. Yoon-sol then pressed forward and unleashed a flurry of strikes. Guillaume Cholyong struggled desperately to block, but after a rapid exchange, Yoon-sol's blade found its mark and sliced into his shoulder. Guillaume Cholyong staggered back, groaning in pain. Yoon-sol raised his eyes toward him and stated coldly that even the finest hidden weapons were meaningless once they had been discovered. To emphasize his point, he lifted one of Guillaume Cholyong's own concealed weapons in his hand and smirked. Overcome with fury, Guillaume Cholyong screamed at the top of his lungs and lunged recklessly toward Yoon-sol in one final, desperate charge. Yoon-sol stared coldly at Guillaume Cholyong as the man lunged toward him in desperation. Their weapons clashed once more, steel ringing against steel. Yoon-sol slid his sword smoothly along the edge of Guillaume Cholyong's hidden weapon and, with a precise movement, countered with a strike that tore through his defenses. Guillaume Cholyong groaned in agony as blood poured from multiple wounds across his body. His strength faltered, and his weapon slipped from his grasp before his body finally collapsed lifeless to the ground. At the same time, Yoon-sol calmly sheathed his sword. For a long moment, he stood in silence, his gaze fixed on the corpse. Then he bent down and picked up one of Guillaume Cholyong's concealed weapons. Holding it in his hand, He muttered to himself that the fight had not been an easy one. It would have been truly dangerous had he not known beforehand about the weapons hidden beneath Gyum Cholyong's clothes. His eyes drifted back toward the body, and he noted that life was leaving his former companion's eyes. What remained was the same expression of desperate obsession he had seen on the faces of countless dying men. Turning away, Yoon-sol walked toward the trainee who had achieved his revenge before dying. He crouched beside the fallen figure, his thoughts continuing. This one, he reflected, was different. What did it feel like to die with the satisfaction of vengeance fulfilled? Once he accomplished his own revenge, would he too be able to smile with the same twisted relief? After a quiet pause, he took the dead trainee's sword and fastened it at his waist beside his own weapon. Rising, he turned his back on the battlefield and disappeared into the forest. From the distance, a voice echoed faintly across the battlefield. It asked whether that figure had truly been him. Dark chi suddenly surged through the area, thick and suffocating. The voice continued, remarking that killing assassins with only the basic sword techniques of the Fire Rain sword set was no small feat. It acknowledged that Yoon-sol was talented, but quickly added that many others on Hell Island were just as skilled. Without constant improvement, it declared, Yoon-sol would not survive. The next day, Yoon-sol was running through the dense terrain, his breath heavy. From behind, several trainees chased him relentlessly. One of them shouted with a wide grin to keep chasing him because he was alone and should not be allowed to escape. A whip sword lashed out from the distance, nearly striking him, but Yoon-sol managed to dodge at the last moment. Another attack followed immediately and struck his back, forcing him to grit his teeth as pain flared. He glared back at his pursuers, thinking bitterly that they would not give up. If this continued, he would only end up dead. He needed to think of a way out. High above on a small mountain, two figures observed the unfolding chase. They were Hyuk Ryonyong and Jin Gak. Hyuk Ryonyong asked how things were progressing. Jin Gak replied that only 41 out of the original 86 trainees remained alive. Hyuk Ryonyong stroked his chin thoughtfully and remarked that 41 survivors after only 3 days was a considerable number, but those who remained should be skilled. He declared that it was time to truly test them and demanded the map. Jin Gak respectfully handed it over, responding with a crisp acknowledgement. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the valley, one of the trainees managed to catch Yoon-sol's sword with his whip blade. Laughing triumphantly, he shouted that he had caught him. Before he could finish speaking, Yoon-sol abruptly let go of his sword and sprinted away again. Panting heavily as he ran, Yoon-sol glanced back and thought that the weapons his enemies carried put him at a severe disadvantage in an open field. Fighting them directly here was reckless. He would need to change the battlefield to survive. Back on the mountain, Hyuk Ryonyong studied the map with a smirk and pointed to a location. He ordered that the restrictions be placed there and that the killer demons of the Fire Rain Sword Sect be released. As the sun began to set, Yoon-sol arrived at the Fire Rain Sword Sect grounds. Not long after, his pursuers caught up. Inspecting the traces of blood on the floor, they stepped inside cautiously. One of them asked if Yoon-sol was hiding within the sect. Another chuckled darkly, saying he was cornered. No matter how much he ran, he could no longer escape. Without warning, Yoon-sol appeared behind them. One of the trainees spun his head in shock just as Yoon-sol attacked. Dodging, the trainee shouted a warning to the others that he was behind them. Turning back, he mocked Yoon-sol, calling him an idiot for thinking they would fall for such a shallow trick. Yoon-sol braced himself for the counterattack. As the trainee lunged, Yoon-sol dodged and blocked with fluid precision. His opponent gasped in disbelief and shouted that Yoon-sol could read the paths of their sword techniques. In an instant, Yoon-sol leaped forward and slashed horizontally, cutting the throat of the trainee in front of him. Without stopping, he closed the gap with another opponent on his left. The man swung his whip sword, but the blade recoiled against the wall of the narrow hall, ruining his strike. Realizing too late, he cursed under his breath, muttering that the space was too crowded. Before he could finish the thought, Yoon-sol was already upon him. With one swift strike, he severed the trainee's arm. The man screamed in agony, while another at the back froze in horror. That one thought to himself with trembling fear that Yoon-sol had deliberately lured them into this confined space. At the front, Yoon-sol stood motionless. His killing intent filled the room like suffocating smoke. As blood dripped down his face, he wiped it away and muttered that in an enclosed area, his enemies had no choice but to shorten their strikes. That weakened their force and made their movements predictable. On top of that, they were not particularly skilled. He calculated that if he fought them one at a time, he had a real chance of defeating them all. One of the remaining trainees screamed in panic as he swung his whip sword wildly. The weapon ricocheted off the walls and came snapping back toward Yoon-sol. He barely dodged it, but the effort caused him to stumble and crash to the ground. Gritting his teeth, he groaned and admitted to himself that he had not expected their weapons to rebound in such a way. The remaining trainees seized the opportunity and began to flee. One of them shouted for the others to run now while they still could. The leading trainee rushed forward but suddenly collided with a towering figure. Looking up in confusion, his face paled. The stranger looked down at them with a menacing expression and spoke in a chilling voice, demanding to know what they were doing. His words struck like a hammer as he asked coldly whether they were trying to run away. The trainees froze as a towering figure appeared before them. One of them smiled nervously and stammered, calling him captain. Another trainee quickly added that of course they were not running away. He insisted that he simply thought it would not be a good idea to fight in this place. Before he could finish his excuse, the man swung his whip sword in a single devastating motion. 3 of the trainees were decapitated instantly, their heads falling to the ground in one swift swoop. Clicking his tongue in irritation, the man muttered that this was exactly why he should not associate with weaklings who had not even managed to reach the advanced chamber. At that moment, Yoon-sul appeared from the corner of the hall. He stepped calmly into the middle, raising his sword as his sharp gaze fixed on the man before him. He asked directly if he was the leader. The trainee at the front observed Yoon-sul carefully and answered with a grin. He remarked that Yoon-sul was skilled and noted that the technique he had seen earlier was from the Fire Rain sword. Yoon-sul asked again if he was their leader, but before he could finish his question, the man cut him off. With a proud tone, he introduced himself as Woo Moon-chang and then asked Yoon-sul for his name. Yoon-sul remained silent, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, the hall fell quiet. When he finally began to speak, Woo Moon-chang interrupted once more. Bursting out in laughter, he declared that a name was pointless. Who would care about the name of a child who was about to die? Without warning, he swung his whip sword to the ground, and with a sudden twist, the weapon bounced from the floor to the walls, snaring Yoon-sul's sword. In an instant, Yoon-sul's blade shattered in half. Woo Moon-chang smirked and said that he had heard about the Fire Rain sword's teachings. The advanced chamber had only taught Yoon-sul a single defensive technique. Yoon-sul stared at the broken weapon in his hand, his expression tightening. He muttered under his breath that Woo Moon-chang knew about the shining mystique. Questions filled his mind. How could this man possibly know of such a secret? Did he have an information network hidden from everyone else? Woo Moon-chang began spinning his whip sword rapidly and shouted mockingly, demanding to know what Yoon-sul was thinking about so deeply in the middle of a fight. He lunged forward, swinging his weapon relentlessly. Yoon-sul dodged quickly, then drew the spare sword he had taken from a fallen trainee earlier. His thoughts raced as he assessed the situation. Woo Moon-chang was recklessly destroying everything in his path. Fighting him in an enclosed space held no advantage whatsoever. Seizing an opportunity, Yoon-sul maneuvered until he broke into an open space room. He stopped to steady his breathing, but Woo Moon-chang immediately followed through a broken wall and launched another attack. Yoon-sul barely managed to block the strike, staggering backward from the force before quickly regaining his composure. Woo Moon-chang stepped into the room with disappointment written across his face. He mocked Yoon-sul, declaring that his skills were far too weak to match him. With a wide grin, Woo Moon-chang released his grip on the weapon, letting it rebound violently through the walls. The whip sword suddenly began to encircle Yoon-sul, its movements forming a circular trap around him. Woo Moon-chang laughed loudly, his voice echoing in the chamber as he proclaimed that his opponent would soon die. Yoon-sul's eyes narrowed as he assessed his situation. He thought to himself that he could block the attacks with the shining mystique, but he lacked the force necessary to stop the crushing pressure of the weapon. Closing his eyes, he focused his mind and considered what he needed at that very moment. He remembered the teachings of Cheon Woongang. Gripping his sword tightly, he realized that what he required was a destructive power strong enough to cut through steel itself. Woo Moon-chang watched the flickering movements inside the ball of steel and laughed once again. He taunted Yoon-sul, asking if this was supposed to be his final struggle. Even if it was, he said, something like the shining mystique would never break free. His words faltered mid-sentence as sparks of lightning suddenly slipped through the gaps of the spherical trap. His eyes widened in disbelief as crackling lightning chi erupted outward. Explosive bursts of lightning shattered the whip sword's formation into pieces. Yoon-sul emerged from the storm of sparks and lightning, his entire form radiating with destructive power. He unleashed his newly awakened technique, unraveled lightning and thunder. In a single bound, he surged forward with blinding speed and struck Woo Moon-chang cleanly. The man's eyes widened, his lips trembling as he tried to form words. Stammering, he gasped in shock, unable to understand what had just happened. Before he could speak, his body collapsed heavily to the ground, lifeless in an instant. Yoon Sol stood hunched over, gasping for air. Slowly, he straightened himself and looked down at his trembling right hand. He muttered quietly that the unraveled lightning and thunder truly possessed a powerful force, what as his instructor had once said. But even as he acknowledged its strength, he coughed harshly into his hand and staggered. Blood smeared across his palm as he realized the truth. The technique was far too advanced for him to wield freely at his current level. Still, he reassured himself that at least he had won, though the battle had consumed far too much time. He reminded himself that the restricted regions would change soon. He needed to move quickly. Just then, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy and suffocating, and Yoon Sol's entire body tensed. He turned his head slowly and felt his blood run cold. His eyes widened in horror as a dreadful realization struck him, with fear rising in his chest. He thought to himself in disbelief. He could not believe it. Standing before him was something he had hoped never to encounter. The killer demon had arrived. Yoon Sol's mind raced as he tried to comprehend the situation unfolding before him. He asked himself why a killer demon had appeared in this place. He wondered if the zone had become a restricted area while he was locked in combat. Yet he reminded himself that he had not ended up here because he fled from battle. He thought that if he had stepped entirely out of the restricted zone, then perhaps the demon's presence carried a different meaning. He cautiously placed one foot forward and stared intently at the killer demon. When the figure gave no reaction, Yoon Sol concluded in his mind that this must mean he was allowed to leave. He quickly dashed past the demon, but as he ran forward, he suddenly felt a crushing presence behind him. An ominous killing intent washed over him, so sharp it was as if his head had already been severed. His instincts roared to life, and without thinking, he dropped low to the ground. A blade whistled above him. A strand of his hair was sliced cleanly in half. Fear surged through him as he realized he had not even sensed the swing. He admitted to himself that without the instincts of the wild beast path, he would have been killed instantly. Stopping in his tracks, he turned to face the demon again and raised his sword. He told himself firmly that he must not be fooled by the demon's calm demeanor. If he attempted to make a move recklessly, the demon would strike preemptively. His mind recalled a conversation he once had with his master, Sa Wu. The master had told him that when a carnivore hunted an herbivore, it was true that the predator was faster, yet the herbivore often escaped. The reason, Sa Wu explained, was that herbivores moved in unpredictable zigzag patterns, making them difficult to catch. Nevertheless, apex predators still succeeded because they struck precisely at the moment that prey made a move. When Yoon Sol had asked if this meant he should face them directly, Sa Wu had told him that it was not about confrontation, but about timing. The predators attacked according to the prey's movements. Snapping back to the present, Yoon Sol understood the lesson. He screamed at the top of his lungs and immediately dashed forward, running past the killer demon once more. His thoughts blazed with urgency. He told himself that he needed to make his movements completely unpredictable. The killer demon drew his sword in response, surprised by Yoon Sol's sudden tactics, and began to follow slowly as Yoon Sol darted outside the sect in frantic zigzags. Yoon Sol thought to himself that the first thing to do was to use predictable zigzag motions, but in an instant, the killer demon appeared right before him and swung with merciless precision. Yoon Sol barely rolled to the side to avoid the attack. He reminded himself that the next step was to use the wild beast path to dodge the expected attacks. Finally, he had to create an opening with movements that could not be foreseen. His eyes widened as the demon's blade came within inches of his neck. He clenched his teeth, realizing he was too late. Yet to his astonishment, the killer demon suddenly pulled back. The blade was sheathed, and the man stopped pursuing. Breathless, Yoon Sol muttered aloud, asking why the demon had stopped. He realized he must have crossed into another restricted area. Relief mixed with despair as he admitted to himself that despite giving his all, he had failed to create even a single opening. Without hesitation, he fled into the forest. His thoughts burned with bitter clarity. That was the power of a true martial master. Compared to them, he had been nothing more than a frog trapped at the bottom of a well. After putting some distance between himself and danger, he paused to catch his breath. Looking down at his trembling hand, he reflected grimly. The killer demon's martial arts had been so overwhelming that he could not even gauge them. Their skills truly were on an entirely different level. His thoughts shifted to his grandfather, the killer, and he admitted silently that man alone possessed the power to rival such strength. If Yoon Sol wanted to achieve revenge, he would have to surpass even that level. Just then, a voice echoed from ahead. Someone called out his name, identifying him as Yoon Sol of the Bu family. On a rock in front of him sat another trainee, cleaning a massive sword with deliberate calm. The man stood and explained that he had been searching for Yoon Sol for quite some time. He mentioned hearing that Yoon Sol had learned the wild beast path. Yoon Sol studied him with sharp suspicion, The man spoke as if he already knew him. Like the others, he must have been sharing information. The trainee then lifted his enormous weapon high and declared that someone about to die did not need to know his name. With a loud shout, he leapt forward and swung his sword down toward Yunsol. Yunsol clicked his tongue, sidestepped smoothly, and avoided the strike with controlled ease. The man smirked at this and acknowledged Yunsol's ability. He praised him, saying that he had predicted the trajectory of the attack with beast-like senses. He even remarked that Yunsol seemed destined to become one of the 10 demon masters in the future. But then his grin sharpened as he attacked again, yelling that it was for that very reason that he had to uproot him now while he was still only a demon seedling. Yunsol blocked calmly, his movements fluid yet defensive, while his thoughts churned. He noticed that the flow of his opponent's strikes had changed completely. The term demon seedling lingered in his mind. He recalled the words of Seo Jinha, who had once said that not all of them were gathered to become one of the 10 demon masters. Could this man be one of them? His musings were cut short as he was forced to block another powerful attack. The clash shook his arms, and he gritted his teeth. He told himself that he needed to cast away distracting thoughts and focus solely on survival. Suddenly, a strange sensation coursed through his arm. His hand trembled slightly. He recognized the unusual pull as he shoved back the trainee's sword. Another strike came, and once more he felt it. A peculiar flow of energy that seemed to draw him in. His mind flashed back to a lesson from his grandfather. He remembered how his grandfather once examined a corpse and declared that the man had been killed by the 5 tiger-severing blades of the Hebei Feng clan. Yunsol had asked how he knew, and the old man explained that although the body bore no external wounds, every bone inside had been fractured. The technique specialized in channeling qi into an opponent during each clash of weapons. His grandfather had said he did not know what offense the man had committed to warrant such a fate, as the Feng clan rarely revealed themselves in the Jianghu. Back in the present, realization struck him. He shouted aloud, declaring that this was the 5 tiger-severing blades of the Hebei Feng clan. The trainee froze in shock, demanding to know how he could possibly recognize the technique. Yunsol recalled more of his grandfather's explanation. The old man had said that one of the signature characteristics of the 5 tiger-severing blades was its powerful absorption technique. When Yunsol had asked what that meant, his grandfather explained patiently. It was a basic application of qi, pulling things inward like a vortex. This drew in the opponent's weapon, interfering with its flow. Then, while the enemy's blade was twisted and compromised, the practitioner would strike mercilessly to swallow them whole, like a tiger pouncing on prey. Yunsol had asked if that meant they were the strongest martial arts sect. His grandfather had chuckled and said that while the absorption technique was tricky and dangerous, it could also serve as a double-edged blade. After all, by drawing opponents close, they themselves became more exposed. Back in the present, Yunsol muttered that he would use that very technique against them. He tightened his grip on his sword, preparing himself. He told himself that he would twist his opponent's weapon toward him deliberately. The trainee braced himself and declared his name at last. He shouted that he was Feng Ak of the Hebei Feng clan. In the name of his family, he vowed to uproot Yunsol, the demon seedling, once and for all. As Yunsol closed the distance, he suddenly drove his sword downward, stabbing it deep into the ground. Feng Ak, stunned by the move, cried out in confusion, wondering aloud why Yunsol would do such a thing. Before he could understand, Yunsol rolled to the side and dodged his incoming strike, then swiftly kicked Feng Ak in the ribs. The force of the blow sent the man staggering back, clutching his side in pain. Yunsol calmly retrieved his sword from the earth. His gaze turned cold and sharp as he fixed it on Feng Ak. A grin spread across his face as the realization settled in his mind. His plan was working. At the front, Feng Ak was still clutching his side. His face twisted in anger as he shouted that Yunsol had dared to play a dirty little trick. Yunsol, however, kept his grin and muttered to himself that it had worked, though he admitted he had not dealt much damage. It made sense, he thought, since his opponent had been training for a long time. Still, he was confident that he now understood how to counter him. He recalled the words of the instructor of the advanced chamber, who had once explained that one must always wait for the opponent to attack first. At the very moment their blades clashed, if one could move even a split second faster, then that was what true speed was all about. With his expression growing serious, Yunsol raised his sword and thought that he would use the energy-absorbing technique against Feng Ak so that he could surpass him in speed. Feng Ak suddenly jumped forward with ferocity. Yunsol braced himself and thought that he would not resist the pulling force of the technique. Instead, he told himself that he would flow with it, letting his sword follow the current. At the last second, he would shift the trajectory. As Feng Ak closed the distance, Yunsol thrust his sword forward, His blade shifted mid-attack, aiming directly for Feng Ak's face. Feng Ak tilted his head at the last possible moment, dodging, though strands of his hair were severed by the strike. He stepped backward, his expression shaken, and wondered what had just happened. He thought to himself in disbelief whether Yunsol had truly used the advantage of the energy-absorbing technique. It seemed impossible. The absorption he himself wielded was strong enough to pull in a distant boulder, and even expert swordsmen struggled to wield such strong powers with precision. There was no way, he thought, that someone so young could pull it off. Shaking the thought aside, Feng Ak lunged forward again, shouting that he would attack once more. Yunsol braced himself and reminded himself that there was no use resisting. The stronger the absorption became, the faster his sword would move. He seized the opening and managed to land a hit, drawing a reaction from Feng Ak, who turned his head in disbelief and demanded to know how long Yunsol thought that tactic would continue to work. Without hesitation, Feng Ak struck again. As Yunsol dodged, he noticed something and realized that Feng Ak was no longer using the energy absorption technique. Feng Ak clicked his tongue in frustration and shouted that he did not need to rely on the technique to win against someone like him. With gritted teeth, Feng Ak jumped forward once more, yelling for Yunsol to take his strike. As his opponent bore down on him, Yunsol stared at him calmly, his thoughts steady. He had been waiting for this moment. Closing his eyes, he muttered the name of his next move, Fire Rain Sword, first technique. Chi surged around him, swirling with intensity. When his eyes opened, he whispered the name of the technique, Shining Mystique, and then he rushed forward to meet Feng Ak's attack head-on. The clash rang out and silence followed as dust settled around them. When the air cleared, Yunsol stood firmly on the ground, steady and composed. On the other side, Feng Ak also stood, though his clothes soon began to tear at the shoulder. In an instant, a gush of blood burst from his shoulder and his mouth. He collapsed to his knees, coughing blood, and asked in disbelief if that had been the technique he thought it was. Before he could finish speaking, Yunsol answered with a cold and calm tone that it was indeed the first technique of the Fire Rain Sword, the Shining Mystique. He muttered quietly to himself that it had been dangerous. In order to turn the defensive Shining Mystique, a move known for its single lethal counter, into a direct offensive strike, he had needed to draw every other attack onto himself instead. Feng Ak, still bleeding heavily, admitted through strained breaths that he would never have imagined anyone interpreting the Shining Mystique in such a way. Yunsol began to walk away without hesitation. Feng Ak, still coughing blood, asked in surprise if Yunsol would simply leave him there. Yunsol responded coldly that Feng Ak was not part of his revenge. His words shocked Feng Ak, who scoffed despite his disbelief and remarked that it was interesting to find someone like Yunsol within the demonic sects. He told him that they should never see each other again. Yunsol glanced back at him briefly, then turned and walked away. When Yunsol had gained enough distance, Feng Ak fell to the ground, breathing heavily with his eyes closed. Suddenly, a presence appeared behind him. Opening his eyes, Feng Ak asked if the newcomer had come to kill him. A killer demon stood there, drawing his sword. The demon told him that Feng Ak of the Hebei Feng clan had been useful, especially for someone from the orthodox sects, but it was a shame. Feng Ak scoffed and asked if the demon had known from the start. The killer demon replied coldly that Feng Ak underestimated the demon palace. Raising his sword high, the demon said goodbye before bringing it down. Elsewhere, within Hell Island, a trainee was running desperately. The trainee staggered to a stop, gasping for breath. With trembling fingers, they plucked a hidden weapon embedded in their hand and threw it away. Leaning against a tree, still trying to catch that breath, the figure revealed herself to be Seo Jinha. She clutched at a wound, her expression hardened by pain. Another female trainee approached her slowly and taunted that she had been unlucky. Seo Jinha glared back, still struggling for breath. The trainee continued, mocking her and asking if she truly thought she could run away after being poisoned by the special poison of the hellish blood castle. The female trainee drew closer, while others from her group watched from behind. With a grin, she added that Seo Jinha was a dead woman walking unless she had an antidote. Laughter escaped her lips as Seo Jinha grit her teeth and muttered to herself in frustration that she had not known such a group would be so organized with stealth weapons and poison arts. She admitted inwardly that there was only so much she could do on her own. Despite her pain, Seo Jinha picked up her sword with her left hand and raised it. The female trainee scoffed and asked if she intended to fight with her weaker hand. She sneered that no right-handed swordsman could suddenly wield a blade adeptly with their left. With a wide grin, she told Seo Jinha to give up. The trainees behind her suddenly leapt forward, throwing hidden weapons at Seo Jinha. She tried to block them, but several struck her, causing her to groan in pain. She muttered to herself that the poison needles had pierced her again, realizing grimly that if she did not take an antidote within 15 minutes, she would die. As she looked ahead and saw the trainees rushing toward her, she closed her eyes and whispered in defeat that it was over anyway. But then, a loud scream echoed, halting the trainees in their tracks. One of them collapsed to the ground instantly. The others shouted in alarm, demanding to know who was ambushing them. From the shadows, Yoon Sol appeared, rushing toward them. Their eyes widened in shock as they turned to face him. His glare burned with menace as he closed in on them. Yoon Sol began to attack the trainees one after another, moving with ruthless precision. Seo Jinha's eyes widened in shock as she watched him single-handedly wipe out the entire group with cold efficiency. When his slaughter was done, Yoon Sol turned his gaze toward her, his eyes cold and unyielding. Seo Jinha cleared her throat nervously, then dropped her weapon as he approached. In a trembling voice, she pleaded, saying she harbored no ill intent toward him. Instead of answering, Yoon Sol crouched beside one of the corpses as if searching for something. He rummaged through the dead man's belongings, eventually pulling out a bottle. Holding it up, he muttered to himself that it was the antidote and reasoned that with it, he would be able to face the rest of the hellish blood castle bastards more easily. He then rose to his feet and started to walk away. From behind him, Seo Jinhya suddenly cried out for him to wait. Yoon Sol turned his head slightly and asked her what it was. She spoke while struggling to breathe, revealing that she had been poisoned by the hellish blood castle. She admitted she had less than 10 minutes before the poison spread throughout her entire body. Yoon Sol responded coldly, telling her she was mistaken. He explained that he had come here with the intention of killing everyone, including her, and that the only reason he was sparing her was because he did not consider her worth the effort to kill. Seo Jinhya lowered her head and admitted in despair that she would die if he left her there. She reminded him that in the end, she was nothing more than a competitor for him to eliminate. Then she raised her head sharply and shouted that there could be another option. She declared that if he gave her the antidote, she would work with him. Yoon Sol showed no reaction at first, his expression remaining cold as he narrowed his eyes and asked why he should do such a thing. Seo Jinhya quickly explained. She said there were about 20 people left on the island, of whom had already formed groups. No matter how strong Yoon Sol was, he could not face them all alone. She offered her knowledge of their martial arts in exchange, promising that it would prove useful to him. She added that if he saved her life, she would never betray him. Yoon Sol thought deeply about her words. From what he had observed of her so far, he concluded that although she had an ego and preferred to act independently, she did not appear to be the type who would betray someone or set up a trick. After a long silence, he asked her what the terms of their agreement would be. Seo Jinha, her eyes welling with tears, said the terms were simple. Until only the two of them were left, they would work together and never betray one another. Yoon Sol gave no immediate reply. Instead, he stood silently while she stared at him with desperation in her eyes. At last, he grabbed the antidote and tossed it to her. Seo Jinha caught it, clutching it tightly before thanking him with relief. She quickly poured the antidote over her wounds. Yoon Sol's attention then shifted. He heard something strange in the distance, and muttered to himself that another restricted area might have been created. He immediately turned to Seo Jinha and told her that they needed to leave. Seo Jinha protested in confusion, saying she did not think the area they stood in had been restricted. Yoon Sol urged her to think carefully. He pointed out that most of the island was already restricted. The fact that another restriction had been triggered meant only one thing. But before he could finish explaining, more trainees began to arrive, one group after another, until the two of them were surrounded. Yoon Sol completed his thought grimly, stating that the remaining survivors were likely being drawn to this very place, and it was already too late to escape. As he scanned the group, his eyes fell on one man in particular. He muttered to himself that this individual was different from the others. One of the trainees then stepped forward, drawing his sword. With a mocking tone, the man asked if they were simply sizing each other up to see who would die, before declaring that they could agree on killing Yoon Sol and Seo Jinha first. Another trainee spoke out, naming them both. He identified Yoon Sol as Bu Yoon Sol, the one who had learned the wild beast path of the Wander Beast Pavilion. He also noted that Seo Jinha's sword skills were commendable, and that she had even investigated the other trainees. He warned the group not to underestimate her. He then revealed his suspicion, saying he had wondered why they had not formed groups of their own and guessed that they must have begun working together. Yoon Sol muttered to himself that their enemies knew more about him and Seo Jinha than he expected. He locked eyes with her, and in that moment, she lifted her sleeve to reveal a small bottle tied to her arm. Yoon Sol immediately recognized it as the powder antidote from before and thought to himself that he understood her plan. Seo Jinha then opened the bottle and shouted aloud that she would use the poison of the hellish blood castle, claiming that would give them a chance. She hurled the contents, releasing a thick smoke that quickly filled the area. Both she and Yuan-sul used the cover to make their escape. The other trainees cried out in alarm, shouting that it was the poison of the hellish blood castle. They panicked and tried to shield their noses, but one trainee soon noticed something was off. He shouted that it was not poison, realizing they had been tricked. Enraged, he ordered the others to chase after them. As she ran, Seo Jinha smirked and thought to herself that the powder only created smoke but worked perfectly to deceive the eye. She reasoned that large, open areas would only put them at a disadvantage, so they needed to head toward the rock formations where numerous small caves existed. While running, Seo Jinha picked up a sword from the body of a dead trainee they passed. She then called out to Yuan-sul, saying that they both needed to find a cave to fight in, and asked if he was thinking the same thing. He confirmed he knew one, describing it as a cave with a narrow entrance and a long corridor. Inwardly, she was shocked by his foresight and thought to herself that it was hard to believe someone like him had merely learned the wild beast path. She wondered who he truly was. After some time, they arrived at a large stone mound. Yuan-sul declared that they had reached their destination. But just as they were about to enter, a menacing fog appeared, blocking the entrance to the cave. Both of them stopped in their tracks. Seo Jinha asked in surprise if the fog had always been there. Yuan-sul responded that something was wrong. Suddenly, the figures of the killer demons emerged from within the mist. Seo Jinha gritted her teeth and exclaimed that the appearance of the killer demons could only mean one thing. The cave had been turned into a restricted area. Yuan-sul agreed, reasoning that their enemies must have been observing their movements and had intentionally chosen this spot as a restricted zone, knowing they would come here. Seo Jinha cursed and asked what they should do. Yuan-sul explained calmly that as long as they did not cross the border, the killer demon would not attack. He then turned around and raised his sword toward the approaching trainees, remarking that if they had to fight, this place was not the worst choice. He reasoned that with their backs to the restricted zone, it would be no different from standing in a cave with their backs to the wall. Seo Jinha drew her sword as well, acknowledging that they had no choice but to fight. Together, they braced themselves for the inevitable battle. When the trainees finally arrived, one of them sneered at the pair and asked if they were done running. He stood directly in front of them with a smirk while the others spread out. Behind Yuan-sul and Seo Jinha, the killer demons remained still, silently observing the scene. At the front, the trainees readied themselves. One of them grinned widely and shouted that the two were giving them more trouble than they were worth. He declared that there was no need to waste more time, and ordered everyone to attack at once. With that command, the trainees leapt forward, rushing straight at Yuan-sul and Seo Jinha. Meanwhile, at the top of a mountain, Hyuk Ryonyang and Jin Gak observed the unfolding battle below. Hyuk Ryonyang stroked his chin thoughtfully and remarked that this would likely be the final battle which decided the 10 demon masters. Back on the battlefield, a hidden weapon suddenly shot toward Yuan-sul. He swiftly dodged sideways, but another trainee immediately launched an attack. Yuan-sul avoided the strike by leaping forward, then retaliated in a single motion, cutting the attacker in half. At the center of the fray, Seo Jinha fought with all her strength. She threw herself furiously at the surrounding trainees, cutting down each opponent who dared to stand before her. But suddenly, a powerful attack lunged at her unexpectedly. She barely managed to block it, yet the overwhelming force sent her flying backward. Her momentum was only stopped when her body collided against Yuan-sul's backs. Now standing back to back with him, both of them struggled to catch their breath while more trainees closed in on all sides. Seo Jinha's hands trembled as fatigue overwhelmed her. Her grip weakened, and at last she lowered her sword. In a quiet, resigned voice, she asked herself if this was where she would die. She closed her eyes, exhaled deeply, and admitted aloud that she had given everything she had to this battle, and because of that, she had no regrets. Behind her, Yuan-sul panted heavily. He muttered under his breath, repeating her words with a questioning tone. No regrets? Memories of his grandfather surfaced in his mind. His expression darkened, and he whispered that he could not die here. Then his eyes widened, filled with overwhelming killing intent. As two trainees leapt toward him, Yuan-sul's sword flashed. In one swift motion, he cut both of them down midair. Their expressions twisted in horror as blood gushed from their bodies, and their screams echoed as they collapsed to the ground. Without pausing, Yuan-sul rushed forward and struck again, cutting down another 2 trainees in a single sweeping strike. The remaining trainees recoil in disbelief, their mouths wide open in shock. They shouted furiously, demanding to know what kind of sword technique he had just used. In a chorus of rage, they screamed that he had to be killed first. Another wave of trainees leapt forward, hurling themselves at him. Yoon-sol steadied himself, recalling the words of his master Sa-woo that still echoed in his mind. His teacher had once told him to move at his senses and instincts dictated, reminding him that he had already mastered the essence of the sword technique. With sharpened eyes, Yoon-sol moved as if guided by those very instincts. In the blink of an eye, every trainee who had rushed toward him collapsed, their bodies cut down instantly. From the mountain, both the head instructor and Jin-gak stared in astonishment, their eyes wide at the display of deadly mastery. On the battlefield, as the bodies fell around him, Yoon-sol thought to himself that he had just unleashed Pavilion Master Sa-woo's sword arts. He realized that with this power, there might be hope, yet his thoughts were abruptly cut short when a punch came flying at him. His senses warned him at the last moment, and he raised his sword to block. The clash rang out as he groaned under the overwhelming force. The trainee who delivered the blow grinned maliciously, declaring that he had caught him. As his fist pressed against the blade, a surge of chi charged around it. Cracks began to spread along Yoon-sol's sword before his very eyes. Then, with a deafening bang, the attack exploded. The force launched Yoon-sol across the battlefield, his body flung violently through the air. Seo Jin-ha turned at once, her face filled with panic as she cried out his name. A nearby trainee scoffed, saying that although it was unfortunate, Yoon-sol was as good as dead. Seo Jin-ha shouted again with all her strength, refusing to accept those words. She demanded that Yoon-sol rise, her voice trembling as she declared that he could not fall now. Yoon-sol's vision blurred. He clutched his head as blood streamed down his face. Through the haze of pain, he heard Seo Jin-ha's desperate scream echo across the battlefield, warning him that he was on the edge of the restricted area. His eyes suddenly widened in realization. Lifting his gaze, he saw the towering figure of a killer demon staring down at him. The killer demon extended its hand with terrifying speed, reaching toward him as he stood on the very brink of annihilation. Before the killer demon's hand could reach Yoon-sol, Hyuk Ryonyoung's voice suddenly echoed across the entire island as he shouted with all his might, demanding that it stop immediately. His powerful command resonated through the air like thunder. Every trainee froze in place, stunned by the authority in his voice. Yoon-sol stood motionless in horror, his eyes wide as the killer demon's hand hovered just inches from his head. At that very instant, his master, Sa-woo, appeared behind the killer demon. His movements were so fast that no one had even noticed him approach. In a single motion, Sa-woo placed his sword firmly against the demon's neck. Yoon-sol looked up weakly and met his master's gaze. Sa-woo looked back down at him with pride, a faint smile flickering on his face. The tension that filled Yoon-sol's body finally gave way, and his vision darkened. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Hyuk Ryonyoung leapt down from the mountain in an instant, landing nearby Yoon-sol. Panic laced his voice as he ordered the nearby instructors to move quickly. He shouted for them to bring the physician immediately before the boy died. Behind him, Jin-gak followed, his tone urgent as he protested that interrupting the third trial would have consequences. But before he could finish, Hyuk Ryonyoung declared that he would take full responsibility. Jin-gak froze, staring at him in disbelief. Hyuk Ryonyoung only smirked faintly, his thoughts racing. He realized that he had finally found the one he had been searching for, a true gem of a warrior. Yoon-sol possessed extraordinary reflexes, an unshakable spirit, and a killing intent refined through battle. He was neither excessive nor lacking in any aspect. To Hyuk Ryonyoung, this boy was a rare genius, someone who could truly become one of the 10 demon masters. Sometime later, in a dimly lit chamber within the Hell Island, Hyuk Ryonyoung stood before one of the palace's elders, Hwa Wimyoung. The elder's expression was stern as he questioned the head instructor's decision. He reminded him that the plan had been to allow 10 to join the 10 demonic sects, along with 2 additional geniuses who would serve as eyes and ears for the 10 demon masters. A total of 12. Hwa Wimyoung's voice rose as he pointed out that Hyuk Ryonyoung had ended the trial with 14, exceeding the limit. He warned that punishment would follow, but Hyuk Ryonyoung only grinned, calmly replying that he was prepared for the consequences. The elder studied him for a moment before letting out a weary sigh. He wiped the sweat from his brow and said that the emissaries from the 10 demonic sects would be arriving soon. He admitted that he had no idea how they would respond to this unexpected change. Hyuk Ryonyoung remained unfazed. He said confidently that there was no way the eyes of the 10 demonic sects were duller than his own. Days later, Yoon-sol slowly opened his eyes. He found himself lying in a quiet room. The faint scent of medicine filled the air. As he sat up, he looked around in confusion and muttered that it must be the place where the wounded were treated. He examined his body, realizing that not only were his external injuries fully healed, but even his internal wounds had vanished completely. He thought to himself that the physician of the Demon Palace must be far more skilled than he had imagined. After dressing himself, Yoon-sol stepped outside the room. An attendant greeted him warmly, smiling as he invited him to follow. Yoon-sol nodded and descended the stairs. But as he reached the lower floor, he stopped in shock. Downstairs, other trainees were sitting together, eating and chatting casually as if nothing had happened. The atmosphere felt strangely peaceful. After sitting up, Yoon-sol's eyes wandered toward the window. He turned to the attendant and asked where they were. The attendant, still smiling, replied that they were now at the center of Hell Island. Yoon-sol repeated the words under his breath, recalling that this was once a restricted area when he had inspected the island earlier. He now understood why. The attendant asked if he would like to order anything, and mentioned that if there was something specific he desired, they could prepare it for him. Yoon-sol thought for a moment before quietly requesting 2 bowls of noodles. A short while later, the noodles arrived. He sat in silence, staring down at the steaming bowls for a long time. His mind drifted back to his childhood, to the quiet moments when he and his grandfather had eaten noodles together. The memory filled his chest with warmth and sadness. Then Seo Jinha appeared, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him with a faint smirk. She commented playfully that he must really like noodles if he had ordered 2 bowls for himself. Yoon-sol blinked and asked what she wanted. She hesitated for a moment, then thanked him sincerely. Her tone softened as she admitted that if not for him, she would likely be in the afterlife by now. Yoon-sol looked at her curiously and said that he had only slain the enemies before him. Seo Jinha frowned slightly and asked if he truly didn't know what had happened. She explained that the head instructor had stepped in to save him, which meant that the total number of survivors had increased to 14 instead of 12. Because of that, she insisted that he had indeed saved her. She admitted that she wasn't someone who usually went around expressing gratitude, but she wanted to make sure he knew she was thankful. Embarrassed by her own words, she changed the subject. She mentioned that it had already been 4 days since he passed out. Yoon-sol's eyes widened in surprise. He said that he thought only a day had passed. Seo Jinha laughed lightly as she picked up her chopsticks, saying he was lucky because the mad physician had been nearby when he was injured. At that, Yoon-sol fell silent, his thoughts drifting. He recalled what he knew about the man, once renowned as the Divine Hand, the greatest healer under heaven. But after failing to cure the illness of the woman he loved, the physician had lost his mind, consumed by grief and a wasting sickness. Even so, it was said he could still save anyone who was drawing breath, no matter how dire the wound. Yoon-sol realized that it must have been this very man who treated him. He clenched his fists slightly as he thought that if only his grandfather had met the physician before his death, things might have been different. Seo Jinha continued eating and said she would tell him a few more things, calling it courtesy for an old companion. She invited him to eat as well since all the talking had made her hungry. Yoon-sol muttered to himself in dismay as he watched her eat his noodles. Between bites, Seo Jinha explained that the enemies they had fought, the Manslayers, were elites from the 10 demon gates. She said that the demon gates selected their successors based on how they performed in these evaluations. Yoon-sol nodded slowly, saying that this explained why their martial arts had rivaled even that of the instructors. Then he asked her if she knew why the head instructor had saved him. Seo Jinha sighed and admitted that was exactly what she wanted to know too. She said it seemed as though Hyuk Ryonyoung was determined to place him in the 10-demon war, and asked if perhaps his sect had some connection with the instructor, or if he had known him before. Yoon-sol shook his head and answered that he had no connection with him whatsoever. She frowned and said that made the matter even stranger. She revealed that Hyuk Ryonyoung had been punished severely for his actions, and had stepped down from his position, returning to the demon field. Yoon-sol's expression darkened as he fell deep into thought. He wondered why someone with no ties to him at all would risk punishment and disgrace just to save him. None of it made sense. Suddenly, a deep bell rang through the air. Yoon-sol turned toward the sound, recognizing its solemn tone. He murmured that it sounded familiar. Seo Jinha immediately stood up and told him that the time had come. She said the bell was a summons for those who remained on Hell Island, which could only mean one thing. The High Council of the 10 Demon Gates had arrived. Later, at the main hall, the remaining trainees stood quietly in the center as the High Council of the 10 Demon Gates arrived. Yunseol immediately noticed their entrance and thought to himself that despite so many people moving, the entire hall remained eerily silent. No footsteps could be heard at all. When the High Council stopped before the group, one of the council members, a man holding a spear, studied the trainees in silence. After a few moments of observation, he pointed toward the section where Yunseol was standing, and spoke in a calm but authoritative tone, asking, "You over there, will you become a demon master of the Necromancer Sect?" The man was none other than Bul Sa, the vice master of the Necromancer Sect, also known by the title, No Evil. Yunseol was momentarily startled, but before he could respond, the person standing behind him stammered, asking if the question had been directed at him. Bulsa confirmed with a nod, addressing him directly. Yes, young Manhwa. Step forward. Will you become a demon master of the necromancer sect? As young Manhwa nervously stepped out, he admitted hesitantly that he had only trained in swordsmanship and had never once used a spear. Bulsa replied without hesitation that it did not matter. According to him, Manhwa was born with a physique perfectly suited for necromantic spear techniques. He placed a finger lightly on Manhwa's chest and explained that his body and natural talent were ideal for spearmanship, which was precisely why he had failed to achieve greater success in swordsmanship, despite his efforts. After speaking, Bulsa turned around and began to walk away, saying that if Manhwa understood, he should follow. Without a second thought, Manhwa hurriedly followed him, answering with an obedient, yes. A short chuckle then broke the tension as another council member stepped forward. Pff, Fufu, my turn, he said with amusement. His gaze swept over the trainees before introducing himself. This old man is named Jeokya-hun, Vice Castle Master of the Hellish Blood Castle, known as the Venerable of 10,000 Poisons, Red Wild Soul. The name alone made the room tense. Several trainees whispered among themselves, fearful of the infamous figure standing before them. They muttered that Jeokya-hun was a poison arts master, capable of killing all life within 30 paces, with just a single motion of his hand. Without wasting time, Jeokya-hun extended a finger and called out to one of the trainees. Seo Jinha, will you become a demon master of the Hellish Blood Castle? Seo Jinha's eyes widened in disbelief. In her thoughts, she questioned the strange offer. She, who had been hailed as a sword genius since childhood, was being asked to join the Hellish Blood Castle, a sect known for its poison arts? She thought bitterly that the most dangerous poison in the world was not in bottles, but within one's heart. Jeokya-hun grinned as he stared at her, his voice sharp yet oddly approving. He recounted how, before the third part of the trial even began, she had used a girl from his castle's martial office to massacre the other trainees, only to kill that same girl later, to silence her. Seo Jinha shouted in protest, claiming the girl had been the first to offer cooperation, and the first to attempt to kill her. Calling her act an intentional silencing was an exaggeration. But Jeokya-hun interrupted before she could finish. I'm not blaming you, he said calmly. The fact that you could kill without hesitation for your goal proves that you are fit for my castle's poison arts. That quality is admirable. He explained further that although she might think herself talented in swordsmanship, it would not be enough to command the Murim. Only the chosen few could rule the martial world with sword or blade. But her talent, he insisted, lay in poison. Hearing this, Seo Jinha glanced sideways at Yunseol. She muttered under her breath about the chosen ones, recalling how Yunseol, who had first picked up the sword during the 10 Demon Masters exam, now displayed martial power equal to what she had attained after 10 long years of training. Her fist clenched tightly as she whispered that she would rather follow this path. She then raised her head and declared loudly that she would go to the Hellish Blood Castle. Jeokya-hun grinned with satisfaction and ordered her to follow him, and she obeyed. After they left, another member of the council spoke firmly. It's my turn. He stepped forward with a commanding presence and introduced himself. I am Wi Hyuk-gun, of the Fire Rain Sword Sect. He was known as the strongest swordsman in the entire demonic path. Wi Hyuk-gun, the sword demon, disciple of the previous sect leader of the Fire Rain Sword Sect. The remaining trainees whispered among themselves in awe. They wondered who he would choose, each secretly hoping to be the one selected by the legendary swordsman. After several tense moments, Wi Hyuk-gun's sharp eyes settled on one figure. You, he said, turning his gaze directly at Yunseol. Boo Yunseol, was it? Not only Pavilion Master Jin but even the other elders have praised you. I also heard you learned the Pavilion Master's philosophy. Yunseol straightened nervously and replied that he had. Wi Hyuk-gun turned slightly and said that he looked forward to seeing Yunseol's future growth. He stated that his sect's swordsmanship could not yet measure the youth's potential, and advised him to continue training diligently. However, Yunseol remained still. After a hesitant pause, he looked toward his former master, Sa Wu, and finally spoke. I will not go to the Fire Rain Sword Sect. Wi Hyuk-gun stopped mid-step, his head turning slowly. His voice grew dangerously low as he repeated, What did you just say? When Yunseol did not back down, his tone turned into a roar. You dare reject a demon master of this sect? A crushing pressure filled the air, pinning Yunseol to his knees. He gritted his teeth and forced out words through the weight pressing down on him, saying that from what he had heard, he was allowed to reject offers. Wi Hyuk-gun's eyes narrowed into sharp slits as he glared down at him. Then tell me, he demanded. Where do you plan to go after rejecting my sect? Yunseol remained silent for a moment before answering firmly. I want to go to the Wandering Beast Pavilion. The room fell into disbelief. Wee Hyuk-gun's expression darkened with fury. He shouted in disbelief, demanding if Yunseol had truly said the Wandering Beast Pavilion. He called it a declining sect and accused Yunseol of trying to insult him and his sect. The pressure in the hall intensified violently, shaking the entire space. Yunseol's body trembled under the overwhelming force, as he thought to himself that his body felt as though it might tear apart under the sheer weight of Wee Hyuk-gun's energy. This was indeed the true power of the strongest swordsman in the demonic path. Suddenly, Sa-woo appeared in front of him, standing as a barrier between Yunseol and Wee Hyuk-gun. The other trainees gasped at the sight, their eyes wide with disbelief. Wee Hyuk-gun's rage flared further as he gritted his teeth and shouted, "You, a mere secret pavilion master, dare to block my way?" The pressure intensified again. Sa-woo clenched his teeth, his hand moving toward his sword as if preparing to draw it. The martial artists nearby stared in shock, whispering among themselves that he must have gone mad to draw his blade before the sword demon himself. At the back, Yunseol called out softly in concern, "Elder Sa?" Wee Hyuk-gun's gaze grew cold and commanding as he accused Sa-woo of overstepping his bounds due to his closeness with Pavilion Master Jin. One of the other elders on the side began to prepare to intervene, thinking that if the sword demon went berserk, the other candidates could be caught in the crossfire and killed. As Wee Hyuk-gun began to unsheath his sword, a hand suddenly stopped him from behind. The man who appeared wore a smirk as he remarked lightly, "Gosh, look at everyone being so anxious." He raised his voice slightly, smiling as he said, "Enough." The entire hall went silent. After a long pause, Wee Hyuk-gun turned his eyes toward the man standing beside him and uttered his name quietly, "Dancheong." Dancheong smiled lightly and waved a hand toward him, speaking with calm ease. "Please let it go just this once for my sake." He was the vice master of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. Seeing him intervene, the elders on the side exchanged uncertain glances before one of them quickly agreed, saying that the matter should be settled there. Another followed, nervously adding that the Wandering Beast Pavilion needed to take one disciple anyway. Wee Hyuk-gun's sharp gaze turned back to Bu Eun-sol for a brief moment. He sighed heavily, then turned away. As he began to walk, his voice echoed low but edged with restrained anger, telling them that if they were going to take the boy, they should leave immediately before he lost control and unsheathed his sword. Dancheong chuckled softly at the remark, clapping once with appreciation. "Thank you for your understanding," he said before turning to Eun-sol with a relaxed smile. Seeing the relief on Eun-sol's face, he spoke again. "Let's go." Sa-woo patted Eun-sol's back gently. The young man nodded and replied quietly, "Okay." As they began to walk, Eun-sol looked back at Wee Hyuk-gun's retreating figure and thought to himself that the man's energy from earlier had been murderous. He swallowed hard, realizing that if the others had not stopped him, he would have been killed on the spot. They continued walking together for a while before Sa-woo broke the silence, speaking with warmth. He said that Eun-sol had improved quite a bit during the time they had been apart. Eun-sol bowed his head slightly and replied that it was all thanks to his master's teachings. Sa-woo laughed, patting his student's head as he said that he had not expected him to choose the Wandering Beast Pavilion, adding that he was proud of him. Eun-sol smiled faintly, and answered that he had simply felt that the pavilion's values aligned best with his own. Dancheong, walking ahead of them, turned back with a grin and gestured forward. "We're here," he announced. "This is the Wandering Beast Pavilion." Eun-sol's eyes widened in disbelief at the sight before him. The place was nothing like what he had imagined. He muttered quietly that he had expected it to be quiet and solemn. Dancheong laughed softly and asked if he was surprised. He explained that unlike other sects that controlled the commercial rights of nearby regions, the Wandering Beast Pavilion prioritized self-sufficiency above all else. Eun-sol glanced around at the people busily moving through the grounds. "But," he began, "is there no one my age here?" Dancheong replied that there had been young disciples who joined after hearing about their legends, but most of them had either run away or died during training. Eun-sol fell silent and answered quietly that he understood. Looking ahead again, Dancheong pointed toward a small structure and said that the spot seemed suitable. After a short walk, they arrived at a modest house. Dancheong explained that this would be where Eun-sol would stay from now on. If anything needed repair, he said, he should tell the man over there, pointing toward a burly figure at the forge. That man was Wang Gul, the pavilion's blacksmith. Dancheong told Eun-sol that he could receive whatever tools he needed from him. He then turned to Sa-woo and said that it was time to go. Sa-woo nodded and patted Eun-sol's back again. "All right," he said. "Take care." Eun-sol looked up at him, confused, and asked whether his master would not be staying. Before Sa-woo could answer, Dan Xiong replied instead. He said that Sa-U was the secret pavilion master, a position without the authority or power to stand against the sword demon. Because he had done so to protect Un-Sol, he now had to pay the price for his actions. Un-Sol's expression hardened as he asked what that meant. Pay the price? He repeated. Then are you going to… Before he could finish, Sa-U cut him off with a smile. Don't worry, he said. It's only a light punishment. It won't take long. He then gave him a firm pat on the back and added, but don't slack off just because I'm not here. This man will keep an eye on your progress. Un-Sol stared at him with concern and said earnestly, please take care. As they began to walk away, Dan Xiong turned his head and called out with a faint smile. Bu Un-Sol, he said. You cannot call yourself a disciple of the Wandering Beast Pavilion just yet. Un-Sol blinked, caught off guard, and asked uncertainly, pardon? Dan Xiong leaned closer and explained that although Un-Sol had become one of the 10 demon masters, that did not automatically make him a disciple of the Wandering Beast Pavilion. His expression then shifted from soft amusement to serious intensity, as he declared that a weakling could never call himself a disciple of their sect. Un-Sol froze for a moment before asking if that meant he could become an official disciple as long as he became strong, nothing else required. Dan Xiong chuckled quietly and nodded. Yes, he said. We don't bother with meaningless formalities. Every disciple of the Wandering Beast Pavilion represents the pavilion itself, so there's no need for oaths or ceremonies. You only need to focus on one thing, learn martial arts, and become stronger. He struck his chest with his arm and continued, do that, and you will be acknowledged as one of us. His voice grew louder and more commanding as he declared that everyone there could serve as Un-Sol's mentor, but it would be up to them to decide whether they wished to teach him or not. The next day, at the tall mountain known as Iron Peak within the Wandering Beast Pavilion, Un-Sol was climbing with visible effort. His breathing grew heavy, and sweat clung to his back. He paused for a moment, exhaling, and muttered quietly to himself that the summit could not be much farther. As he climbed, Dan Xiong's voice echoed in his memory, his instructions from the day before. Climb Iron Peak tomorrow. There is someone there who will teach you the best internal energy cultivation technique that exists. After what felt like hours, Un-Sol finally reached the top. The instant he arrived, a voice called out to him from nearby, asking if he was the one chosen as one of the 10 demon masters. Un-Sol looked toward the direction of the voice and saw a bald man standing with his back turned. Bowing politely, he began to speak. Yes, Vice Master Dan told me. Before he could finish, the man turned his head slightly and interrupted. He said that Un-Sol must have come to learn internal energy cultivation but remarked that he had already learned one. With a sideways glance, he asked whether the boy was still not satisfied. Un-Sol blinked in confusion at the man's remark. The man turned more fully to face him and observed that there was true qi oozing from his body, so much that it was as if he had been cultivating systematically since childhood. Un-Sol shook his head quickly and explained that he had lived as a mortician when he was a child and had never learned any cultivation technique. The man closed his eyes and smirked faintly. That leaves 2 possibilities, he said. In an instant, his figure blurred, and he appeared directly before Un-Sol, his gaze sharp and fierce. You're either a liar, he said, or you learned it in your dreams. Un-Sol froze in place, swallowing nervously before responding that he was not lying. He told the man that he could check for himself. The man paused for a moment, then asked coldly if that meant he was allowed to destroy all of his true qi. Un-Sol met his eyes and replied firmly, of course. The air around them grew silent as the man grabbed Un-Sol's left arm and began to examine the flow of energy. Moments passed before his expression changed abruptly. His eyes widened, and he muttered in disbelief. This kid. His voice rose slightly as he continued. His body is brimming with true qi, but it isn't circulating at all. That means he gathered all this energy in his lower dantian without any cultivation technique. That shouldn't be possible. Without warning, he yanked Un-Sol's arm closer and shouted furiously. Who was it? Who taught you to collect true qi? Un-Sol responded with confusion, asking what the man meant. The man then released his arm, composed himself, and cleared his throat before speaking again. He asked whether anyone had ever taught Un-Sol how to calm his mind or how to breathe properly in the past. Un-Sol replied that his grandfather had once taught him a breathing technique. Upon hearing this, the man instructed him to demonstrate it. Un-Sol took a deep exhale, followed by an inhale, and began performing the breathing technique. Watching him closely from the front, the man's eyes widened in shock as he thought to himself that Un-Sol was executing the technique while standing upright. He wondered whether this meant Un-Sol could circulate his qi in any position, and he further noted the exceptional nature of the technique itself. He abruptly interrupted Un-Sol's practice and told him to stop. Crossing his arms, he asked whether Un-Sol's grandfather had truly taught him that method. Onseol confirmed that he had, explaining that his grandfather had taught it to him during their childhood games of playing corpses, saying it was the best way to breathe while lying in a coffin. The man then revealed that this was no ordinary breathing technique. He explained that it was a method for gathering true qi into the dantian, a practice of qi circulation and breath control, distinct from standard internal energy techniques, that merely enabled one to use the qi already present in the body. He added that Onseol's dantian already contained 10 years' worth of internal energy. Stunned, the man demanded to know the name of Onseol's grandfather. Onseol answered, Bu Janyang. Upon hearing the name, the man repeated it slowly, and declared that there was only one person in the Mirim known by that name, the former vice-master of the Demon Palace, and once the strongest swordsman of the Demon Path, Bu Janyang. Onseol froze at these words. Internally, he questioned how his grandfather, whom he knew as a humble mortician, could possibly have held such a fearsome title. He found it unbelievable, and wondered why someone of that stature would choose such a quiet, ordinary life. The man then added another revelation. The breathing technique Bu Janyang had taught Onseol was actually a method originating from the Shaolin sect. This sent Onseol's thoughts spiraling. He realized that Shaolin belonged to the Orthodox Mirim, which meant his grandfather might have originally been a martial master of the Orthodox faction. The implications terrified him. If this truth ever came to light, not only would he lose his standing among the 10 demon masters, but his very life might be in danger. At the front, the man watched Onseol with a smirk, and assured him that he harbored no doubts about his background. He reasoned that the Demon Palace's intelligence network was undoubtedly thorough, and would have already investigated Onseol extensively, though they likely remained unaware of this particular breathing technique. He then pointed directly at Onseol, and declared his intention to teach him, honoring a promise he had made to the Wandering Beast Pavilion. He emphasized that he did not care whether Onseol had been trained in orthodox or demonic martial arts. However, he issued a chilling warning. If Onseol ever taught this technique to someone else, or even revealed a single character of it, he would kill Onseol and everyone connected to him. Onseol remained silent for a moment, before solemnly vowing his commitment. The man studied him for several seconds, then turned and walked away, announcing his name as he did so. My name is Hyul Gyumgang. Hearing this, Onseol was struck by disbelief. He muttered to himself in confusion, wondering why a monk's dharma name would contain a character like Hyul. Hyul Gyumgang paused and spoke again, asking whether Onseol knew the difference between orthodox and demonic internal energy cultivation techniques. When Onseol admitted he did not, Hyul Gyumgang explained that orthodox Mirim cultivation methods followed natural pathways to gradually build internal energy within the human body. In contrast, the demonic path employed any means necessary to accumulate large amounts of energy quickly, often violating the body's natural balance. Though this granted immediate power, over time, orthodox practitioners ultimately developed superior true qi and internal energy. He went on to say that the technique he intended to teach Onseol transcended the boundaries of demonic martial arts, and was in fact, the most extraordinary and miraculous cultivation method of all. To illustrate the cost of such excellence, he lifted his left hand, its fingers severed halfway, and revealed that the pain of learning the technique had been so unbearable that he had eaten his own fingers. Only those capable of enduring such unspeakable agony, he said, could achieve a body perfectly attuned to internal energy. He recounted his past. Once a martial master of the Azure Dragon Temple in Yunnan, he had been framed for murder, expelled, and had his internal energy sealed. During his recovery, the Wandering Beast Pavilion had aided him, and in return, he had promised them his cultivation technique. If Onseol failed to learn it, Hyul Gyumgang would break that promise. Therefore, he announced a test. He would use his true qi to pierce all 365 of Onseol's acupuncture points simultaneously, a process normally performed gradually and with great care, to cleanse Onseol's meridians completely. Doing it all at once, however, would inflict unimaginable pain. He advised Onseol to back out if he lacked the confidence to endure it. Onseol cleared his throat and confidently declared, "I'll do it." Hyul Gyumgang smirked, raised both hands, and shouted, "All right. Don't regret it?" He placed his qi-infused hand firmly against Onseol's abdomen, and a violent surge of energy erupted around them. As he performed the technique, Hyul Gyumgang reflected that using true qi to puncture every acupuncture point was akin to scraping bone with a blade. He wondered how long Onseol would last, but then his eyes widened in astonishment. Not only did Onseol remain utterly silent, but he also appeared calm. There was no foul odor, typically emitted when impurities were expelled from the body. suggesting that Yoon Seol's meridians had never contained tainted energy to begin with. Hyul Gyumgang released him. They stood still for a few moments before he broke into a wide grin and began laughing maniacally. "Did you say your name was Bu Yoon Seol?" he asked aloud. "Yes," Yoon Seol confirmed. With a broad, exhilarated smile, Hyul Gyumgang exclaimed, "I will teach you my internal energy cultivation technique!" 6 months later, at the summit of Iron Peak, Yoon Seol stood motionless at the very edge of the precipice. Behind him, Hyul Gyumgang casually picked up a massive rock, grinned, and hurled it directly at Yoon Seol. As the rock hurtled closer, Yoon Seol did not flinch, react, or move an inch. The moment of impact arrived. The rock shattered into fragments upon striking him, yet Yoon Seol remained perfectly still, unmoved by the force. Hyul Gyumgang, already holding another large rock in his hand, smirked and declared with satisfaction, "You have definitely mastered it, Bu Yoon Seol." The moment Yoon Seol turned around, Hyul Gyumgang watched him with a proud smile, thinking to himself that it had taken the youth only half a year to learn what had taken him 3 full years. He believed Yoon Seol was improving far better than he had anticipated. More importantly, the boy had successfully dispersed the excess true qi within his body after learning the circulation technique. In doing so, Yoon Seol had tapped into his dormant potential and grown healthier than before. Hyul Gyumgang eventually spoke and signaled for them to begin, and Yoon Seol responded without hesitation. A short time later, Yoon Seol sat in a lotus posture and circulated his qi, quietly resolving that reaching the first level had not been enough. Since this circulation technique possessed 8 levels, he insisted he must at least reach the second before leaving this place. Hyul Gyumgang stood in front of him, observing with pride, until impurities suddenly seeped out of Yoon Seol's body. His eyes widened with disbelief as he realized that the boy was touching the second level, the realm of the untainted bone and muscle, where bones and muscles achieved their greatest efficacy. He understood, however, that such abrupt changes placed immense burden on the body. Yoon Seol began to groan under the strain and blood dripped from his mouth. Hyul Gyumgang rushed behind him, placed a hand on his back, and demanded that Yoon Seol abandon every unnecessary thought and focus. Internally, he knew the youth would suffer severe internal wounds if he failed to restrain the violently shifting qi. With no other choice, he decided to use his primordial essence true qi. A flare of energy surged around both of them. After several tense moments, the air calmed, the area stilled, and Yoon Seol gasped awake. He stared at his own body with disbelief, overwhelmed by the strange sensation. Realization struck him, and he looked back and called out to Hyul Gyumgang, asking if the elder had transferred his own true qi and why he would do such a thing. Struggling to stand, Hyul Gyumgang stated that there was nothing to worry about. He could not leave the Wandering Beast Pavilion if the boy failed to learn properly. Yoon Seol paused, silently acknowledging that despite the elder's rough manner, he was deeply caring. He told Hyul Gyumgang he would never forget what had been done for him, but the elder immediately replied, "No. Forget my existence?" Those words reminded Yoon Seol of Sa Woo, who had once insisted that whether hatred or kindness, it was best to forget. He wondered why everyone told him the same thing. Hyul Gyumgang continued and declared, "If you really want to repay me, reach the 8th level, the realm of great origin." He admitted that achieving the end of the 5th level had been his personal limit. Yoon Seol was taken aback, staring at his mentor's back, but accepted his guidance with renewed determination. The elder then told him that because he had reached the 2nd level, he no longer required his instruction. What he needed now was not mastery of circulation, but completion of basic martial arts. He ordered the youth to climb the cliff at the western edge of the Wandering Beast Pavilion and train there. Yoon Seol bowed deeply and asked the elder to take care, and after a brief pause, Hyul Gyumgang wished him the same. 3 months passed. One night, inside an inn of the Wandering Beast Pavilion, a man drank at a table and reported that the founding divine squad had just returned after eliminating the Azure Dragon Pavilion. His companion laughed and commented that it made sense, since those people had harmed one of their disciples. Who else but the founding divine squad would volunteer for such a mission? The first man admitted that it was refreshing to hear. He mentioned that the Wind Cloud squad should be returning soon as well. As he said this, several figures sprinted across the rooftops. His companion remarked that they had spoken too soon. The first man frowned, wondering aloud why they would not simply use the doors. More figures moved from roof to roof until one stood dramatically at the edge. Someone appeared beside him without warning and commented dryly, "Goodness, you are standing there as if you want someone to paint you." That man questioned why Baekhyun had not simply come straight to the Azure Wind Pavilion instead of posing theatrically. The squad leader of the Wandering Beast Pavilion's wind cloud, Baekhyun, slowly turned and recognized the man behind him, addressing him as the Vice Pavilion Master. Dan Chiang smiled and reminded him that when it was only the two of them, he preferred being addressed by name. Baekhyun refused, claiming the rules of the pavilion were already loose enough. He sighed and admitted he had been meaning to speak to Dan Chiang anyway. When the Vice Pavilion Master muttered in confusion, Baekhyun demanded to know why he had brought someone with tremendous potential into the ranks of the 10 Demon Masters. He pointed out that Dan Chiang had opposed this plan at first, and questioned why the youth had been brought here instead of being handed to the Fire Rain Sword Sect. Dan Chiang explained that it had mostly been the boy's decision. He had rejected the Fire Rain Sword Sect's offer. Baekhyun, shocked, could hardly believe it and murmured, "He chose us?" Dan Chiang scratched at the back of his head and complained that he had nearly fought a crazed sword demon elder over the situation. Then he smiled brightly and claimed that Baekhyun should feel proud, because the youth had made his choice. Baekhyun, however, mentioned that because of this, the Fire Rain Sword Sect had chosen none of the 10 Demon Masters, and that their leader expressed disappointment. Dan Chiang simply replied that he understood. Baekhyun stepped closer, raised his voice in frustration, and reminded him that the Demon Palace had already been wary of them, and they had suffered greatly because of it. Dan Chiang continued smiling and told him that he had stayed in the Jianghu too long. The Wandering Beast Pavilion pursued mastery of martial arts, not political power. Baekhyun scoffed and dismissed it as nothing more than idealism. Still, he admitted he had something he needed to do. He demanded to know where the new Demon Master was, stating that the youth's position among the 10 Demon Masters was at stake.